stars be with you.
All right, all right, all right. We are back with the Energetic Principles podcast for a very special episode. We are doing the year ahead for 2024. And of course, for the fifth year in a row, I have invited Gray Crawford here to join me to talk all about the annual forecast. Thanks for joining me again, Gray.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be doing this again with you.
I can't believe it's been 5 years. That's
Yeah, basically everyone since the 2020 preview, which is perfect. We're doing this again because that's one of the big themes of this year is all this new dissolution, new emergence of things that started happening in 2020 and hitting a big sort of critical phase of development with multiple aspects of what was going on then.
I know. I feel like we've seen so much. We've seen so much in our time of forecasting for years ahead. It's like, and it started at just the right time, right? We first forecast 2020, and it really is like the beginning of a new chapter. So we are back for 2024, and there is a lot of celestial action to share here today. So before we get started, just in case you're new to the podcast, you're new to me, you're new to Gray, you're new to whatever, I'm going to give Gray a second to share a little bit about yourself. Who are you, Gray?
Well, you can find my work at graycrawford.net. I'm an astrologer, do a variety of, primarily, I guess, natal consultations are what I do the most, but I do some horary also. Sometimes I help people with electional stuff. Have a number of actually courses this year I'll be doing. So I also teach. I guess we can talk about that later and speak at conferences. And I also have a Patreon that you can check out, which is just my name, Gray Crawford. You can find a link on my site and everything.
Yes, Gray has a wealth of knowledge in astrology and also a wealth of words to share. So if you like reading about astrology, and especially from a poetic lens with the Piscean, character that he is, definitely go check out Gray's work. So, all right. Well, oh, gosh, where do we begin? Where do we begin? This is always the question. So it only seems right to start with just an overview of what 2024 has in store. And I have, so before we do these podcasts, before I do any podcast, I always have an outline of what it is we're going to talk about. And especially when we do have the year ahead is like the outline and then this big mind map and then there's this and this and this. And so Gray, I am going to give you the opportunity to tell the listeners and me, what do you think is like the biggest piece of 2024 as far as an overview, the biggest piece of what's happening in your mind, whether it's a transit or even just a vibe?
Well, to me, the biggest alignment of the year, in my opinion, is a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, and we can definitely go into that at greater length. It's the main like outer, from Jupiter on outwards. It's the one alignment of, as far as something actually coming together, one cycle ending and another cycle beginning. We'll talk more about this, but it happens every 14 years, basically. So we had one, 2010, 2011 was the last one. And that is a cycle that is one of the more really obvious, powerful cycles to learn about in astrology that has a lot of really clear thematic manifestations that typically happen, and which is really explained beautifully in Cosmos and Psyche by Rick Tarnas. That's one of the main cycles he went into there, as well as Saturn Pluto, which so we have in 2020, when I was just mentioning that before, besides the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction and that new cycle starting, which, among other things, is all about, I guess, innovation and really breakthroughs that kind of take developments to sort of like another level beyond where things were in all fields, is just a general meaning of that cycle. But we have a number of things building off that 2020 sort of inception. 2020 began with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which was a major thing. It timed it with very well with the beginning of the pandemic. And that 2020 year ended with a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn at the first degree of Aquarius, which was a major sort of epochal shift, because whether it basically, you know, we've talked about this before, and I'm sure most people hearing this already know all this, but, you know, 80, you know, beginning of the 80s, we had a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Libra in the tropical zodiac, which was the first one in an air sign. And in 2000, it went back to Taurus. But if you use the mean conjunction of them, which is actually what the older form of tracking these into 200-year elemental cycles actually used, the first one was actually in 2000, and it was in Gemini. And it's just which frame of looking at that you use. But 2020 brought us into, you know, mean conjunction and just tropical conjunction. It's Aquarius. We're solidly into this air era that goes for about 200 years. I think in terms of tropical conjunctions, there's not one out of the air element till like 2059, 2159 or something like that. So we're really solidly in this new era of air, which is this huge deal. And we've seen already all these waves of change. And so building off that 2020, you know, new Saturn Pluto, new Jupiter Pluto, new Jupiter Saturn, this year we come into the waxing square aspect between Jupiter and Saturn. And that's massive. So we basically go from Jupiter, Uranus starting a new cycle. Jupiter's a really key player. And then Jupiter is going to move out of that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction into a square with Saturn. So at the same time we have a new Jupiter-Uranus cycle beginning, we're getting this big critical waxing square turning point of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle hits. And that's going to have big manifestations. At the same time, even though it's not that traditional like major Ptolemaic aspect, Saturn will move into a semi-square with Pluto, which is the 45-degree angle. So like the classic like 8-phase model of like the lunar cycle people often talk about. If you're familiar with that, and like, you know, 45 degrees is like the crescent phase.
That waxing crescent, yeah.
Yeah, Saturn Pluto hit that. And that comes in May, the first one, which is basically following the Uranus Jupiter conjunction, and right before Jupiter goes into
Jupiter
Gemini,
Saturn,
starts up that up. So also then we have, of course, Pluto going into Aquarius and spending most of the year hovering around that 0 Aquarius degree, and then we'll talk about kind of dipping back to 29 Capricorn again. But so that again is also hitting back to that 2020 Jupiter Saturn conjunction. So that's one of the just most basic themes to me.
Just some basic themes, you know, just some big world themes.
Everything changing in 2020, which is massive, right? And we're really moving into this critical point relating to those cycles.
Yeah. And one, it's so to say that this is the moment we've been waiting for, like, because that was a feeling a lot with 2020, 2021, and just this weird dynamic of where the world is, sitting it out for a long period with the pandemic. And okay, well, now where is this going? How is it changing? What's the new world? Where's the action? And this is, to me, we said this in the 2023 forecast, how there was going to start to be. This year was more of the opening up, really the opening up to the cycle. But it's this year that brings, the 2024, that brings all those dynamic activations that you were just describing. And as Gray has said in the past, I think on the podcast about 2025 and 2026, those are very dynamic years too. So we can kind of think about in a broader stroke of what's happening this year. It's a pivotal activation point, especially with what you're saying with Jupiter Uranus too, because that is, I mean, any year that we have a grand conjunction taking place, something significant is happening, ending, seeding. You know, there's the two heavyweights come together, and there is some sort of collective dynamic or shift that takes place. And so, wow, there's going to be a lot to talk about that. Luckily, I had some notes with Jupiter Uranus, that if you had listened to the Wade Caves program that I did with Jupiter and Taurus back last year, I shared some things there, but I want to bring them back up because I think that and then pair them with what Gray has to say, because they are pretty, it's definitely a potent moment.
Yeah.
I think that like what you said with the Pluto dynamic obviously is huge. We're dancing, doing the final dance between 29 degrees and 0 Aquarius. But I also think it's interesting that Neptune is finally reaching the 29th degree of Pisces too. So there's these two mammoth of planets that affect us collectively and, you know, psychically, are at these anaretic degrees that are very potent in the sky. And yeah, and so of course those are going to be big. The eclipses, we got some big eclipses. We got the total, you know, the next big American total eclipse that, that everybody was talking about back in, you know, 2016, 2017, when we had the Great American Eclipse that happened across the country from Oregon and down through, right? Was it through the South? Did it go all the way through the South, that one?
Yeah,
I
it went
think.
out in South Carolina area, which there
Yeah.
was like a yeah, really horrific like mass shooting that happened around there. Um, as well as that weird almost like KKK kind of march people were doing. I don't even remember that, but that was like going on, and it was notable because like it was sort of like that's where the eclipse, the area of
Yeah.
that South Carolina region was sort of like where the eclipse was going out. Yeah.
And so we're having the second installment of the Great American Eclipse, essentially, with the total eclipse that's coming up through Mexico and going across the Midwest zone and up through Detroit and that area. So which is an interesting part of America. I know not all listeners are from, you know, here, but of course Gray and I are, so we have a different kind of scope of talking about this country. But that is to have that area of the country, I want to say illuminated, but it's actually the opposite, right? Because it's being
Yeah. I mean,
taken away the
Americans,
light.
yeah, we tend to make everything about ourselves too much, but in this case, it really is something where this eclipse is actually focused on Mexico and the United States,
Yeah.
and it's really is going right up through that region where I mean, there's a number of things. There's all the issues around abortion in Texas, which is a big story. Then obviously probably the most obvious connection with all of that is immigration and refugees, obviously focused to Mexico, United States, but then you know that's just another massive global issue that's been going on and will continue.
Yeah. I also think about that area too, of how it has just been rocked in the last 40 years or so, with just the dynamic of um work. And these used to be very thriving communities, but you know, especially like Ohio and the car business and Detroit, and then there was this demise of the job market there, and then the housing structures, and so it's an area of the country that has gone through immense change already because of certain social and political dynamics. So I'm intrigued as to how this eclipse is going to activate that belt of the country. And then also I remember seeing, and I can't remember who it was that gave this lecture, but right before the 2017 eclipse, there was they did a lecture on the two eclipses as pairs and thinking about their intersection of where they actually meet, and sort of the strength of what could go on in that that hot spot. Of course, now I'm trying to think about where it actually was. Was it
Isn't it?
Tennessee or like kind of? I need a map.
I feel like it's in the area of Texas ballpark, but I don't remember specifically where it is.
I think it
Um,
was. No, it's a little bit farther up. I want to say
okay, I guess it's not.
that's cities. It doesn't have. I'm looking at a map that I'm Mel. You need to work on your geography, girl. Uh,
Tennessee, Tennessee, just visualizing in my mind, you're right that Tennessee would make sense.
since
For some
Tennessee or
reason, I had
maybe
it in
like
my mind that it was
Kansas
okay.
or
Is it more
Missouri. Is
Kansas?
that Missouri, Arkansas, sort of that zone?
Like
Anyways,
St. Louis or something?
yeah, yeah. Anyways, we got some dynamic eclipses coming with the Aries, with Libra, and also we're gonna get a Pisces. We're gonna get a Pisces eclipse, right, Gray?
Yeah, so there's a Pisces eclipse close to Neptune. So that's a whole nother thing. And when you're referencing 2025, 2026, which is when Saturn and Neptune will start coming together and hitting that 0 degrees of Aries degree,
Yeah.
which is also around the time that Uranus comes into Gemini. And that's when stuff's really going to go down with much more amplified,
Mm,
even more than what's going on now. Theoretically, we would all be expecting that. Something's really building to that. So this year is like a real critical entrance into that sort of acceleration. And yeah, that lunar eclipse in Pisces in the middle of September is really close to Neptune. You know, the moon's basically waxing from Saturn into Neptune. And this year, like you're saying, Neptune gets up to like, it's hovering around that 29 Pisces degree, and Saturn gets up to about 19 Pisces. So they get within about 10 or so
yeah.
degrees of one another. So we're kind of, I feel like last year, I know some astrologers think you really need to use like the orb of Saturn, but I feel like it was pretty obvious that the co-presence of Saturn and Neptune and Pisces was clearly happening. And then that being said, we're going to get another much stronger wave of that coming in this year, which will only intensify in the following 2 years, but that's already been going on. That's going to come up even more, which definitely has a lot of just massive disillusionment, dissolving of things, breaking things down, which will all be a part of how stuff starts reassembling.
Mm,
There's already been a lot of concerns around also how this has affected water issues, water
yeah.
life, access to water, and because of all these things, we can expect that to only intensify because sort of similar to like that Saturn Pluto alignment and the fact that eclipses made that so much more powerful.
Mm,
The Saturn Pluto, I mean the Saturn Neptune is also going to we're going to end up having these eclipses hitting it, which especially lunar eclipses, if I'm remembering right, are the ones that really hit it hard. And so that's just going to really
yeah.
intensify how impactful the Saturn Neptune would have been anyway.
Yeah. Especially around thinking about lunar eclipses and just the sea dynamic and the ocean dynamic
Hmm.
and just the connection that the lunar energy has with the ocean and its powers. And I mean, we see whales rising up right
Hmm.
now. It's like the intelligence of these animals trying to get the message across. Yeah, yeah. Anyways, that is a big theme that will start to creep in. Very appropriate Neptune word. We're going to start to creep it in, but it's true. Second Saturn moved into Pisces. It's like you can't deny who's in the room, right? It's very
Hmm.
apparent, and we're just in the buildup. So a couple more things that are happening this year before we get into the kind of step-by-step delineation that we do is we also have Mercury retrogrades that are going to be switching from earth signs to fire signs. There'll be a little bit of an earth taste in
Hmm.
in the late summer. But
Hmm.
for the most part, we are shifting to fire, which is exciting as fire is. We're getting off those more practical survival sort of dynamics that Mercury retrograde and Earth can bring. But what's your take on Mercury retrograding through fire signs?
Yeah, I think use the words exciting. I mean, it can be potentially. I mean, honestly, Mercury retrograde in an element could be bringing up issues you got to work through related to that
Exactly.
element. But the thing is, at the same time, it ultimately leads to a lot of innovation, which I think
Hmm.
is actually really one of the themes of this year, with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction also coming in kind of paired with that, is that facing difficult, critical phases of development and maybe things not working out the way you had hoped, but being kind of forced to innovate. And because Mercury retrograde does bring a lot of innovation into whatever area it's hitting, yeah, that fire element, I guess it makes me think about things around, obviously fire is always enthusiastic and wanting to burn, and but ultimately can really create a lot of like breakthroughs and movement, and it really gets, it's of all the elements, it's the thing that really gets things moving.
Hmm.
um of course, it also requires things to burn, and it needs something
True.
to burn and fuel to be provided for it. But I guess that's something to be, yeah, I just feel like it adds in potential, it adds into, I think, an atmosphere where there will likely be extremely difficult current events going on. As we're talking right now, just devastation brought by Israel into Gaza is very much going on right now as we're talking, with no end in sight. And that combined with a lot of other issues, I know as we're recording it now, there's so many difficult current events going on in the world that creates a lot of fear about where things can go and what can be done about them. And I don't really see that ending this year. I saw an article even in the New Yorker talking about people's like news exhaustion. They were doing like the top 10 news stories of the year, and they were showing statistically, they've shown like there's been this dramatic drop in people even paying attention to the news and what new. And it was, even all the news stories that were like the most popular reads for the New Yorker weren't necessarily like the ones that were about the big kind of crises things
I see.
happening. And but at the same time that that's going on, um obviously this depends upon where you are and your circumstances, but there's a lot of innovation and growth and change, and really taking whatever ability you have to reshape your life and direct your life and create something new with your life. That is really going to be there. And I think the Mercury retrograde and fire signs is going to be really adding into that sort of providing that fire element into
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. That spark, that I mean, that's the thing, is like when you take care of all the uh, practical dilemmas and problem solving and just that day-to-day reality, is like when you kind of sort that stuff out, and then all of a sudden you're thrown into the creation element, and the vital, and the spirit, where the spirit is, and then sorting out um the well, I don't want to say difficulties around that, but it can be like, okay, well, now I've done this, I've been there, and I'm like, well, where am I now? What do I want out of life? Where am I going? Like, what makes me feel alive? Like, what doesn't make me feel alive? And how do I reconcile that with everything that's going on in the world, and where my place is, and just these more of these spiritual sort of reviews of how you can use your vital energy to, yeah, I feel excited about life. It's hard. I can see why people are dropping off. I have information exhaustion, news exhaustion. I
Hmm.
mean, we and that's a difficult thing, because it's a slippery slope. We don't want to be in that state, because obviously, especially with Saturn Neptune coming and all these dynamic elements, it's like you can't check out. But this is the exhaustion is the creation in our own making. And that's the whole thing with all this air energy that's coming in, and Pluto and Aquarius. It's like we have to find, we can't bombard people, because then it's just going to, yeah, we're just going
Well,
to have to check out for
mm,
our sanity,
yeah.
and that's dangerous.
Well, I definitely think what you just brought up with the Mercury retrograde and fire signs is really important. And I think that's a really good theme is what you're talking about, like checking in with, where are you feeling your energy is being really drained and you're losing your vitality, and what can be used to really recharge and kind of light your flame again. And like, what's this flame that you can really kind of tend, and what's going to really feed that fire? Because we need what we need with where things are going in the world is people getting fired up
Yes.
and like
Yes.
getting inflamed and but not in a way that's because of what will also be happening is there's definitely things being lit on fire and people really swept up into things and bigger movements, and that can be really positive, and that can also be destructive, and people can
Yeah.
lose a sense of themselves. And so there's sort of a way of but at the same time we do need everyone to get fired up and get more like taking responsibility for what you're contributing to how the world's going. I think the other thing about that, though, is what you were just mentioning with the news exhaustion. In this age of air that we've entered, and with Pluto coming into Aquarius, it also really puts a premium on the way the air element, especially Aquarius, can be about, information control, even to the
Mm,
point of like brainwashing. And we've been in a cycle of the news. I mean, I think people don't know what to trust in the news anymore. And then there's also all these like manipulative
the deep
entities out there
fakes.
trying to put out different false news,
Yeah.
and that's going to obviously be accelerating probably even more with AI advancements. And so I think that's another factor too. Like I think people are not even sure what to even look at for news coverage as far as accuracy, and
Yeah.
um, doesn't
So,
have a lot of bias like involved in it.
yeah. And that enter Pluto and Aquarius. I mean, that's the deep dive. That's the work. That's the that's the dark that needs to be rooted out in order to live in the world and how it's changing, right? I think this is that going to be the work that we do there, or partially some of it. So, yeah, that shift of Mercury is going to be very dynamic, and we're going to be feeling it in our, I like the term you use, Gray, fired up. And speaking of fired up, the last really mention before we go on to looking at the individual months is Mars.
All
Mars
right,
is
yeah.
going to be going retrograde, but not until the end of the year. So it's not until December that Mars actually goes retrograde. It's going to go retrograde in Leo, about 6 degrees Leo, and it's going to retrograde back into Cancer. And Mars retrogrades are always, newsworthy. Some news you definitely want to read about. But this one's going to be a little extra special because it's going to have a relationship with Pluto and be opposing Pluto in the anaretic degree of Capricorn and Cancer, but then also in the Leo Aquarius axis. And
Mhm.
so even though we're going to get a taste of it at the end of this year, it's going to stretch into 2025.
Mhm.
This is an aspect. This is big news to me. What do you think, Gray?
Yeah, and it's a dramatic difference between the end of next year compared to the end of this year. The end of this year has, to me, more some beneficial positive astrology we can talk about. The end of next year, it's much more
Wow.
wild and like, yeah, just really stormy and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um not only Mars, but I would say the Mars Venus cycle is another really key element this next year.
Yes.
So they're going to basically come together in February, around February 22nd, at basically 7 degrees of Aquarius. There's a
Mhm.
Mars Venus conjunction. That's always really important to pay
Yeah.
attention to. That Mars Venus conjunction is configured pretty tightly to Jupiter, squaring it. And the moon just happens to be flowing through Leo opposite at the same time. But that degree of Aquarius, the opposition between the moon and Leo and the Mars Venus conjunction in Aquarius is basically the same degrees as where Mars ends up stationing retrograde at the end of the year. So there's something about this Mars Venus inception of this new cycle that become in February which is always about very much to me what we've already been talking about. It's all about, you know, what do you really want to create? What do you want to bring into your life? What are your what are the values and ethics and desires that are sort of underpinning how you go out and, you know, fight for what you believe in and go after what you want in the world. And the other thing about the Mars-Venus cycle is, we'll talk about this later, but when we get to the very first square aspect that Jupiter and Gemini formed with Saturn in Pisces, the Mars-Venus cycle also is at a waxing square overlapping that alignment. So Mars-Venus come into a square aspect basically around the same time that Jupiter, Saturn come into a square aspect, and Mars will be in Gemini, conjoining Jupiter in Gemini, and Venus will be in Virgo, squaring Mars and Jupiter, and opposite Saturn. So like it creates this T square of like Saturn in Pisces, Mars and Jupiter in Gemini, Venus in Virgo. And that's in like around August 19th or so. So what's brought up by this Mars-Venus cycle, and then how that ends up feeding into the Mars retrograde at the end of the year, which is opposing Pluto, is just a massive element of what's going on. There's also a Sun-Venus conjunction in Gemini in June, which is kind of squaring Saturn. So that actually comes in. There's a Venus, like Errol Gutman's Venus star point, you know, and how important those alignments are when the Venus, we're at a Venus in Gemini star point, superior conjunction. That's also kind of pinging that same mutable degree where Jupiter ends up going and everything. So yeah, that's a really, I would say Mars and Venus are also very, very important this year.
Which, as you're speaking, Gray, it makes me think is, I mean, we've had so much action in the fixed signs in the last couple of years, and we, other than Jupiter and Uranus, which is a big aspect, we're really leaving this territory for obviously the cardinal action that's in the eclipses, but there's just so much taking place in the mutable signs, and just thinking about the prevalence of mutable action paired with cardinal action. You know, the transitions and the pivots and the there's a lot of movement, and a lot of flexibility and a lot of shifting that is going to be taking place this year through the tension of those aspects that you just described. So yeah, we'd be wheeling and dealing this year.
Yeah, and the mutable, you know, being someone that's extremely mutable myself, what you have to embrace with that is the fact that you're maybe going to have multiple things going on at once. You're going to maybe be starting one thing and going to another thing, but you have to always just keep on coming back. You got to circle back, keep working on. It's just kind of getting everything. There's going to be more of a tendency to have different things we have to manage, but circling back around, it adds.
It's not
to
a straight line.
Yeah, it's more of it's really emphasizing the non-linear aspect of reality that's there anyway, but just really doubling down on that. And but it also really points to being flexible and being able to mutate and shift as needed.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
It's not going to work to just be like, this has to be this certain way.
Yeah.
Like, that's not going to work. You're not going to be able to be that way.
No, Saturn will be like, no, you gotta double body it. You gotta come here. You gotta go there. You gotta do what I like to call sidewind. You guys, like, you're a snake, you know, it's the movement isn't just, it's like, no, we gotta go here. We gotta go there. We gotta go here. We gotta go there. And it's just, it's,
serpents are a great analogy for things going on. And I think not just that shifting like you're describing, but the shedding and then, you know, there's really something where like it's like the skin is shed in a lot of ways this year, and it's really like, you know, what are you going to become? You know, you're, and if you're still, I guess, holding on and you're fighting, you're resisting the shedding of whatever that skin is that's been happening this past I guess 3 to 4 years especially. If you're not already involved in that process, you're going to have even more, I think, intensity kind of pulling you to look at that and shed whatever that is that's been in the way.
All right. So get your skin brush out. I don't know if anybody does a
Yeah.
skin brush, just start brushing because we're gonna be losing some skin here.
And it's
In
gonna
a
be the
positive
year.
way.
Just reminding me. It's speaking of serpents. The
Oh, it's the
great serpents.
dragon.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It's gonna be. It is the year of the dragon. Which I mean,
Mm.
I'm not an expert in China astrology, but that's years of the dragon are a really big deal, and it is a year of the dragon, which I think does point to like this big another sign of it being a critical year. Yeah, the year of the dragon.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's okay. Well, let's channel in our dragon vibes. If that's not Mercury retrograde in fire either, like I just a fire breathing dragon. So, all right. Well, all that being said, Gray, I think we should get to it. So if you're watching the video, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so we can look at some charts here. And usually how we do this is we go about the zodiacal seasons more and kind of start with, January 1st is a little arbitrary when it comes to, oh, that's the beginning of the year. But when we're thinking about from a celestial lens, it's more of this solstice placement. So we're going to start with Capricorn season. And work through our winter months. Well, if you're in the northern hemisphere here. So let's think, Gray, what is sort of the best way? I'm trying to think about the best way to approach it. Like, I guess do like a little overview of just kind of the main things that are going on in the season. And then honing in on them. Do you have any thoughts there, or you just want me to just go with it?
Sure, we whatever feels best to you. I mean,
Yeah.
that's I think good in terms of giving an overview if you want ahead of time.
Yeah. So Capricorn season, just to relay, God, this will over if you're gonna listen to the program with Shu Yap, of course we're gonna overlay a little bit here, with the podcast that just came out before this one. But one of the main things that there are a couple main things that are happening in Capricorn season. We obviously have Mercury still retrograde. We start Capricorn season off with a conjunction with Mercury and the Sun on the 0 degree Capricorn point, which is very
Yeah,
impactful.
it's a
Yeah,
really powerful
it is.
and Mercury's just separating from that sextile to Saturn and the sun's moving into it. So there's also like even that sextile with Saturn, and then also the obviously the trine with Jupiter, and the moon's flowing in there with Jupiter. So it's an extremely, to me, now there is some Mars Mercury happening at the same
Yes,
time, but
there is.
to me that can also be about this real deep visioning of what we've been talking about. What do you really want to go out and create this year?
Yeah. Yeah. There is this sort of coming into 2024 alone is this, nebulous, dreamy, what isn't, where it, what am I perceiving? What am I inspired by? What is falling away? It's just, there's an incubation happening at the end of this year with Mercury, Mars, Neptune. And that really leads us to a dynamic start. I think that one of the things about Capricorn season and just the beginning of the year is that we get a dynamic start pretty much right away in my mind. I'm just going to fast forward into January. And because once Mars moves into, so Mars is going to move into Capricorn right at the beginning of the year on January 4th. And by that time, Mars is almost getting to the place where it's, out from under the beams of the sun. It's not quite there, but I think it getting into its place of exaltation and
Yeah, no, it's extreme. It's entering its exaltation while teleptically rising. It's
yeah.
extremely powerful.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
Mars is like on steroids basically at this point, at the beginning
yeah.
of its cycle, right? So it has that extra juice
Mm-hmm.
behind it. So that paired with a lot of Earth trines that are going to take place. Especially once Mercury gets back in there, we're going to have these flows to Jupiter, to Uranus. A lot of obviously Capricorn action. And then we're going to have the square to the new moon in Capricorn is going to be a square the nodal bendings, or no, it's going to be at the nodal bendings, but squaring the nodes. So that's always a pivotal moment just in yearly astrology. And then we cap off the end of Capricorn season with the conjunction to Pluto at 29 degrees and 59 minutes. Like what a way to end a season. So Gray, any what do you think about those movements or anything to add? Some talking points.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you're showing here with this new moon that happens on January 11th, really the central, if one of the central themes is Pluto, and Pluto being at that final degree, we get that new moon that comes in conjoining Pluto January 11th. That might make people remember again back to 2020, because this is basically around the same time that we had the eclipse and the Saturn Pluto conjunction. So this new moon comes in very close to the degree of the Saturn Pluto conjunction in 2020, while it's also the final Capricorn new moon that is applying to a conjunction with Pluto and Capricorn. We've had a bunch of them over the years, but this is the last one. Next year, Pluto will be in Aquarius for good, but when we get to the Capricorn time next year. So that's definitely one thing is this extreme amplification of Pluto at the final degree. Because the other thing, like you mentioned, is at the very end when the sun comes up to the Pluto the conjunction between the sun and Pluto, it's at like 29:59 Capricorn. So like the very next day the sun goes into Aquarius, and then not long after that Pluto goes into Aquarius. So basically the sun and Pluto sort of go into Aquarius together. So it's really emphasizing that transition. But the other thing is that we get that beautiful, I really love that solstice chart so much. If you are not someone that normally really makes some sacred space and time for yourself on the solstice, really make an attempt to do that this year. And then that week following the solstice chart, as we get to the end of 2023, going in the beginning of 2024, we get Jupiter stationing direct at the end of 2023.
Yes.
Mercury stationing direct at the beginning of 2024. Chiron stations direct also at the end of 2023 around the full moon. And then when we get to the end of January, which is, I guess we're jumping ahead to the Aquarius part, but once Uranus stations direct, which is around, if I'm remembering right, like January 27th.
27th, yeah.
We're gonna get to this point where everything is ultimately by the end of January, everything will be moving direct, and will continue to do so until the beginning of April. So it's like this there's a big emphasis on the turn of the year this year with Mercury and Jupiter stationing, and it's just it's a year where I feel like the idea of like really setting intentions and really centering on that with the Mercury Sun conjunction coming in. This is like actually a year where that really works, I feel like, to really be making those deep intentions for the year. And then there's by the end of January, there's just this huge, push forward with all the planets moving direct.
Yeah.
So that's something to really prepare for. And compared to the rest of the year, this is a time to really take advantage of as much as you can.
I agree. It is literally by the time we get to the Uranus stationing at the end of January, it's full steam ahead, essentially. And like you were saying, Gray, just the fact that Mercury stations on the, January 1st, Jupiter 2 days before that, just getting that sense, especially after having that incubation period of going through the Mercury Mars, Neptune vortex, and all of a sudden we're leaving the fire energy and really rebirthing in the earth, right? With this January 11th new moon, that is, it is trine Uranus here right before Uranus goes direct. There's just momentum. There's momentum that can be capitalized on in January. And that's the thing. So let's continue forward in our trying to like work all this trying to like work on
Yeah.
annotation and then do this and like, all
While you're
right,
doing
here
it,
we
just
go.
to reemphasize what you've already been bringing up, is that just that 29-degree, as you're
Yeah,
coming into
that's where
this.
I'm
So just
going.
to think about this, there's a really nice article that Brian Clark wrote that I think the Mountain Astrologer was recently sharing a link to, but going into the kind of writing up an extended, Brian Clark's an astrologer that lives in Tasmania, but he did has a very beautiful, poetic, symbolic use of language.
Mm,
It's definitely one of my role models in the astrology world in that way. Talking about, that 29, I really like the way he described this. It's sort of like a boundary crossing, even if, we can say it's imaginary. Obviously, at least half the astrologers in the world, if not more, don't even think this is the end of a sign, because if you're using the sidereal zodiac, we're
yeah,
not at a sign boundary. So, but if you're thinking tropical zodiac, it's a boundary. But he used the analogy sort of like growing up in Canada and crossing in the United States as a kid, and like even though that's also an imaginary boundary, it's still something that we humans, we're all these people, we're agreeing as a boundary.
it's a state of a
and
line.
and then just his sense of like, how the landscape would change, and just approaching that boundary crossing. And if you think about any boundary between one state being and another, or one land and another, or cultures, or whatever it is, there's something where we're at that final culmination point, and we can sense there's this other thing on the other side. And it's this massive threshold, and it's a massive collective threshold. um Also, he brought up, which I really like, this idea that threshold guardians and deities and
Mm,
new gods and so forth often show up when we're at this time, which is
mm,
something that's clearly happening. And of course, we had a very, last year we had Pluto in Aquarius for a little bit, for a few months, but this year when Pluto goes into Aquarius, it'll spend most of us the year, and it'll have a pretty solid almost 9 months. It won't be till early September that it goes
September.
back
Yeah.
to Capricorn. So we're having the whole first part of the year, it's all Pluto and Aquarius. Yeah.
We're getting a full take. We're not just licking it. We're like we're taking a bite out of Pluto and Aquarius, basically, to use a Cancerian food analogy.
Yeah.
But there we do have to take in the potency that is the synodic cycle of the Sun and Pluto at the last minute of
In the last minute.
our
Yeah.
perceived threshold. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, because it's not even just the I mean, obviously, to me, Gray, there's just so much symbolism here, because obviously there is the connection of, okay, well, this is the culmination of an illumination of the consciousness that we have gained since it moved into Capricorn. But there's also this, just because it dances in with Aquarius at the same time, to me, there's also this illumination of this year-long cycle about the like ending of the Earth age in itself,
Mm.
right? Like from
Mm-hmm.
a much larger standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
and why we're seeing the destruction that we are in systems failing, and how like power grabs for old value concepts, and the way that money is shifting, and like just all that. It's really going to be a big theme illuminated this year, in my mind. And so, yeah, this is a tricky aspect, and we're just gonna have to live it out to see, how the cycle and and that, just to reiterate the fact that Mars in at the end of the year is going to
Yeah.
oppose that this exact degree when Pluto is back on it for the final time. There is, yeah, I don't want to say the shit's going to hit the fan, but we're going to see what 29-degree Pluto in Capricorn
Yeah.
is, and what it
It's
needs to
extreme.
wrap up.
Yeah, it's extremely powerful. And I mean, like you mentioned, Mars has recently likely risen at this time. Mars is
Yes.
in this new cycle, in his exaltation, but then that's when this is happening, but where Mars goes in this cycle, and ultimately right before stationing retrograde, ends up coming back to oppose that same Pluto 29, in Cancer. Then we'll go retrograde and oppose Pluto again, and then we'll go direct eventually and oppose Pluto again. So like it is, there is something really there. And
Yeah.
it's definitely the positive way to think about this is definitely thinking about all the stuff with your own personal growth and the way things have changed. And since 2008 with Pluto and Capricorn, it also does unfortunately mean just a cyclical return to various horrors and horrible things, monstrosities from that time period. And one of the things I have noticed about the Israel and going into invading Gaza is if you go back to when Pluto first went into Capricorn, not long after Pluto went to Capricorn at the end of 2008, there was this big invasion of Gaza and a lot of human right abuses that happened. There had been a ceasefire that had ended that year. And I think Pluto had gone into Capricorn earlier that year for a little bit, but it was after Pluto kind of came back to like firmly enter Capricorn. And then that happened very soon afterwards. And so when Pluto got back, retrograding 29 Capricorn and squaring the nodes, and we come into the solar eclipse hitting it like that, it was as one example that Israel coming back, that's just taken over the news, and people talking about it being a genocide. And so, and then there's that's just one example, but there's something about that coming to the end of a sign where a lot of these cyclical things just kind of come up again. And it doesn't actually mean that they're going to necessarily resolve, but it's like you're just confronted with it again, I guess. It's things come up again. There's also a lot of economic uncertainty in 2008, also with a global,
True.
collapse. And that's, we're coming around to people wondering how much of that's going to happen or not. I know there's different opinions about that, but there's definitely economic uncertainty out there too. And certainly some people are doing really well, but lots of people are really struggling around the world. And that's something that's going to feed into how things are going to go down, in the years ahead.
Yeah. And what comes to mind as you're speaking, Gray, is just thinking about back to, straight up survival issues when it comes to the last degree of earth signs here, and thinking about just even in here in America and how we're already having there's been a lot of news lately about the fact that corporations can continue to buy up housing, and it's difficult to find houses. Like the price of a house is getting astronomical, and there is this these bigger entities and these power structures that are taking away sort of these like basic rights to like freedom and to live and to have your own spot, and the laws and the regulations and the bureaucracy that allows that to happen, and that being a very critical, like just all these things. But that falls into the financial aspect, that falls into the property, the housing, the shelter, and what's right, like what's corrupt about that. Like that's because at the end of the day, Pluto likes to show what's corrupt in the world. So to move on, because we have like so much to talk about here, but I think we can really kind of ride still the Plutonian theme as we're in Aquarius season, right? Because as Gray had already said, Pluto follows the sun right into Aquarius, and not too long after we have a full moon in Leo that is going to oppose Pluto, oppose the sun, and then go on to square that now direct Jupiter, which definitely has a lot of oomph to it. But to even sort of just carry on from from that, as we have Uranus stationing direct right around that time too, as the moon squares it, right? There's some volatility, I think, to this period in late January.
Yes, particularly right here where you have it, because then Mercury Mars comes together. That's something else that's been going on in this
Yes.
whole background this whole time we haven't talked about, is after Mercury stations direct, then Mercury goes into Capricorn, and Mercury and Mars are just traveling together basically all through this this lunar cycle, and they come together like just after the full moon. But
Full moon, yeah.
essentially the full moon is really amping up that Mercury and Mars, and then the full moon
Which,
also
real quick, Gray, just because you already pointed this out about the station of Mars retrograde, this is actually the station direct point, the opposition of the station direct point of Mars. Mars is retrograde. It's 17 Cancer. So just throwing that little factoid in there, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Wow, that's really interesting. So yeah, that's means there's a Mercury Mars conjunction opposite where it ends up
And at the bendings of the
stationing
nodes.
direct, and then later in February we'll talk about this. When Mars is like opposite where it ends up going retrograde, it's conjoining Venus. So there are other planets. This full moon's a really big deal, partially for that, exactly what you're talking about, and then also the full moon being really close to the degree where Mars does go retrograde. So it's kind of it's got a few different threads that are foreshadowing what will ultimately go down with that Mars retrograde that comes in at the end of the year and proceeds into the beginning of 2025. So it's sort of like, I mean, that won't be really honestly that helpful for you at this time.
Yeah, well,
but that things that develop, things it's one of those things where maybe later you look back at your life and different news stories, and then you're like, oh, you'll make connections. Things will have bigger implications than you could really know right now than the way things will end up playing out. Yeah.
And so start to pay attention to obviously this polarity in your chart where Leo and Aquarius sit, because there's going to be a lot of activity here. Obviously, there already has been in the past, but here we have different activating points taking place. So know that the end of January, especially when we think about this polarity in your chart, is going to be activated. And then the Uranian story too, because that Mercury Mars is going to be trining Uranus as it's stationing, really facilitating the Earth flow that we were talking about earlier. That is a theme of January. January has a lot of Earth trines happening. And when we have Earth trines, that means things are, in a practical sphere with our day-to-day reality and the survival issues of life and how we're embodied, that things are shifting, things are changing. And that can be exciting. That can be very literal, where it's like, oh, I've been thinking about this for so long, and now this is a reality. Like something shifts and it becomes a reality.
Yeah, with that full moon time with Uranus stationing, just keep in mind how Uranus, really is fully amped up here as far as making a strong presence in personal and collective events, combined with that Mars Mercury trine. So, I mean, we could definitely, this is one of those things where there could be some really big news stories that are really obviously important, and also personal events, just like big sudden changes, something happening really, that in some cases it could be really obvious, and in other cases it might be the kind of thing where you realize later on how important it was.
Yeah. And that's the thing to take into consideration with these cardinal energies, just in general, is that they are pivots. They pivot to the next thing. Solstice, like Capricorn, Cancer energies, these are like extreme pivots that take place. And I think, as Gray, as you're speaking, what kind of came to mind is this being a foreshadowing point actually for Jupiter, Uranus, because the sun is squaring Jupiter at this point. We have, Mars, Mercury. So there's a bridging of the gap. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, the full moon's basically translating between Jupiter and Uranus as Uranus is stationing. So it's definitely you're right about that.
Yeah, so actually, let's continue on to the new moon, because there's going to be like the hot spot in February to me is like after this new moon, we're going to have these Plutonian activations and Venus and Mars, but the new moon is actually going to be in a square to Uranus, right?
Mhm.
So here we have this, and this is nothing new. We've had some Aquarius new moons that have been, and Leo new moons that have been squaring Uranus in the last couple of years. But because Jupiter's getting close there, we just had all these Earth trines. There is something to be said about the dynamic Uranian flavor.
No, this is a really big deal, and I don't know if this is a good time to have us go more into the Jupiter-Uranus meeting. But
Yeah, if you feel, yeah, sure.
Jupiter-Uranus will ultimately not come together until April. It's around April 20th or
20th.
so.
Mm-hmm.
But they're already within 11 degrees right here. They'll obviously be getting closer. And because Jupiter's moving ahead now, Jupiter moves faster than Uranus. So like this is like we're Jupiter's moving direct and picking up some speed and we're heading into it. But like you just said, we got a full moon in Leo followed by a new moon in Aquarius that are basically setting it off. The full moon
Yeah.
squaring Jupiter, the new moon squaring Uranus. And it's also just timed with Uranus stationing direct. So I think the Rick Tarnas, in his book, which traces, um, we're like kind of like one of the best chapters is sections is really on the Jupiter Uranus and all these incredible research findings he has, which were based upon a 15-degree orb. So Jupiter is within that 15-degree orb of Uranus here. And so, the idea of breakthroughs and innovations, we can say that, but I think the thing with Jupiter Uranus is you have to also take in mind like how the extremity of when we're saying breakthroughs and innovations, they really have coincided with entire reconceptualizations of reality. If we even just think about what's one of the biggest ones that's happened, which Cosmos and Psyche is very much centered on, is the importance of the heliocentric revolution and things, people like Copernicus and then Kepler and Galileo,
Yeah.
and us reconceptualizing how we fit into the entire universes and multiverses and everything else, and we're actually on a planet orbiting the sun, because Copernicus published his first work about this with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. Later on, Kepler with planetary laws of motion, Galileo with like the telescope, and Kepler and Galileo come in on this later. Also on Jupiter-Uranus alignments, feeding into like the whole scientific revolution, right? And even like Isaac Newton coming with his ideas that the probably the most archetypal I don't know idea people have of Newton and like the falling apple, right? There's that story where like, Newton sees this apple falling. That was apparently a Jupiter Uranus conjunction
moment.
time
Yeah.
period. And that falling apple, I think, of Newton is a really great example because obviously, in terms of world events, people all around the world did not know that Isaac Newton just saw an apple fall from a tree, but how that sparks all these ideas. So there's a couple of things that can happen. One is that we have really big events. I mean, things like the United States Revolution, as well as the French Revolution. They begin with Jupiter Uranus, like Patrick Henry going like, "Give me liberty, give me death," is like Jupiter Uranus. And then there's also big like the Copernicus Revolution, heliocentric revolution. Darwin later and Wallace published their paper on evolution, completely reconceptualizing things. Also Jupiter Uranus, but it's also things like people just like that Newton seeing an apple fall, and these things that are later going to have these massive effects on the world. And that's the kind of stuff you're going to see in your own personal life. These smaller moments of inspiration and sort of epiphany that sort of take you out of where you were. Because if one of my favorite writers about Jupiter Uranus is Dane Rudhyar, the astrologer, and the way that he described it, I always found really helpful for myself understanding it, which is basically we're talking about Jupiter, Saturn and their cycle, which is, going to be a big player this year. That, Saturn is sort of, in a way, providing that form, and Jupiter's that growth and like life force, but Jupiter's going to tend to be alive and grow within that sort of skeletal structure that Saturn's providing, which there's some tension there, and Jupiter can't quite expand beyond. But what Uranus does is it really kind of opens up that Saturnian skeletal system of form, which obviously recent years has already been kind of shattered with and already hit with the Saturn Uranus squares. But we're moving out of that Saturn Uranus period into this Jupiter Uranus. This is where Jupiter Uranus really they stretch things beyond what people were able to conceptualize previously. And when we're talking about all the AI and all these other things going on, it's really the kind of thing where, yeah, I mean, reality really can warp and change. And even things like quantum physics later comes in. There's really key developments to quantum physics, which is Jupiter Uranus. Depth psychology, the unconscious, Freud publishing stuff on Jupiter Uranus. Later on, people like Stanislav Grof with transpersonal psychology and James Hillman with archetypal psychology come in on Jupiter Uranus, which is all about the inner landscape of the unconscious and how powerful that is. So there's which completely changes our conception. Modernist literature at the turn of the 20th century that was kind of inspired by that. Also Jupiter Uranus, like it's always something that really comes in. And so we're already having some, strikes and labor issues is certainly something else we could talk about. And that's already been happening this past year. But it's really kind of, I feel like when we're getting into this period here with this new moon, there's something where this Jupiter Uranus time period is sort of like really coming into focus here.
Yeah, there's so much to what you said, Gray. And like the thing that sticks out immediately to me is when you're talking about like Newton's apple dropping and what that sort of breakthrough or that understanding or that birth of the innovation, how impactful that is, that you might not see it in the moment, but how it really grows over time. Because one of the big things, and I love all those examples with Jupiter and Uranus, and what we got to keep in mind with this particular Jupiter and Uranus, though, is the fact that, what is awakened, what is these breakthroughs and these totally new conceptual things is going to affect us physically. It's going to affect us in the real world. And we're already seeing that with AI and innovation and in the job markets, et cetera. But what can happen, especially around this new moon, is that immediately my mind goes and thinks about the fact that the whole Taurus Aquarius is not done, because there's going to be an opening square from Saturn to Pluto later. And so here we have this Jupiter from Taurus to Aquarius. And so here we have this Jupiterian, in the expansion and the understanding of what the progress or the evolution actually is. And then the form of Saturn comes much later. You think about something being birthed and like, this is just an idea, like Facebook. It was just an idea and it became this, and then it took over the world, like, like how many years later. But so it takes time to manifest like that. But so we could see something, especially in the news, that's like, oh, this, this totally new breakthrough, or this new piece of technology, or this, this is being proposed that can change, how society functions, maybe monetarily, or in the job sphere, or in the food realm, but it's just that beginning of it. So and then there's all the Pluto action that's about to come here, right? Because we definitely probably need to move on, but there's great. There's so much like to this time period.
Yeah. And I mean, just to give one other example, what you're just to kind of give some concrete examples if people are not familiar with this, especially by like Rick Tarnas at one point, I wrote these down because I was like, this is like a really great string of examples he gave of these are all things that happen at success, not all right in a row, but basically going from one Jupiter Uranus conjunction to another, skipping a few. But like 1831, there's electromagnetic induction. 1844, the first telegraph. 1879, the electric light bulb. Which, I mean, electric light bulb is such a massive change that it's hard for us to conceptualize now what that was. 1920, first radio broadcast. 1927, first sound motion picture, first television transmission. 1969, first internet transmission. And then the next opposition, 76, is when Steve Jobs and Wozniak are doing like the first personal computer. But you can just see those examples. I mean, that's so much connected to
it's huge.
What's now really underpinning the age of air.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's massive. And we might not conceive this in the moment, but the planets are in the works. And yeah. And especially during this period, we thought, full steam ahead. There's a lot of juice here. So, well, mark that time period. Mark February 9th as the day the world changed. No, but no, it is big news. So let's continue on from this. We're getting further into Aquarius season, and this is actually when big shifts start to happen more in the Pluto zone, right? We're going to get Mars-Pluto conjunction. So basically we're going to get Mars-Pluto starting February 13th, Mars-Pluto. Then we're going to get Venus-Pluto.
So the other thing there is
16th.
You can see that. Mars right before this new moon, even Mars and Venus are they're already coming together, but then they both go into Aquarius around the same time, hitting Pluto. So that's really massive.
Yeah, so that's massive. And then basically on the 21st is when we actually get the Venus-Mars conjunction. As Gray has said already, 6 degrees of, right, we got 6 degrees. They go over to 7.
Not exactly. It's right. Yeah. It's basically, if you round up, it's 7 degrees. I have it as 6 degrees, 57 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just to reiterate what Gray was saying earlier, how it's going to be exactly opposite the 6 degrees of Mars going retrograde later in the year. But think about this. We are in, Venus and Mars are no stranger to Pluto. They have been hanging out in this realm for a little while here. And of course, that's probably why we're seeing the dynamics of love and war that we are in the world right now. But thinking about them making their conjunctions with Pluto before this conjunction is a little heavy, a little heavy, but also very, very dynamic. And the interpersonal relationships and collective relationships and how that's all going to be shifting or re-solidifying in some way based on some sort of like integrity hit or some sort of power play or some sort of changing dynamic that is necessary, or purification process that goes on.
Yeah, I mean, always I'm not saying anything that's different than normal, but we always think about interpersonal relationships are always going to reflect collective events and stuff, but there is a extremely powerful thing this year. If you just think about Mars, Venus and their cycle and what they mean, which definitely has to do with what you want in relationships, what you want, what's important to you with your values, right? To create with, to protect, to fight for. The 2 planets that are just on either side of us in our orbit around the sun, right? The inner planet, Venus, the outer planet, Mars on the other side of us. That it's incredible how they're connected to all this, just with them coming together right on top of Pluto. So they're really sparking what is this meaning of Pluto and Aquarius. Yeah. And then they're squaring Jupiter, which means they also start their beginning of their inception of their cycle is basically squaring Jupiter, and then they each take turns squaring Uranus. So they also then get configured right into that coming Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. Yep. So they're so connected. And then they later come in, like I mentioned, in August when we get to Jupiter-Saturn square, they're right there. in the
Yeah.
moment. So like it's the cycle is so connected to these much larger sweeps of change that are coming through.
Yeah, which brings it right down to us, right? It makes it personal. And one of the things we have to really take into consideration, I think this is a good segue actually to talk about this other dynamic going on, which is Chiron on the North
Mm,
Node. And thinking about the nodal axis, right? We're still in nodal territory that has to do with Mars and Venus. So the fact that Mars and Venus is so interconnected to Pluto, to Jupiter, to Uranus, to Saturn, all these shifts speaks to just the eclipse energy that's going on. But
hmm
let's think about Chiron on the North Node. I mean, any initial thoughts come up with this configuration? Because it's going to happen smack dab in the middle. The exact is February 19th, right as all this Mars, Venus, Pluto action is going on.
I think it makes me think about there's no way forward unless you've got to work with all the difficult
Mm,
one of the things that's we kind of skipped over talking about Pluto at the end of Capricorn, but just as an example of something that a lot of people have been talking about, it's the United States Pluto return.
yeah.
So all like the worst atrocities and woundings and toxic issues connected with the history of the United States has all been resurfacing. And I think Chiron is a centaur that really can show up in so many different ways to different people. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
one of the common terms is the wounded healer, and that is one way, but it can really show up in all sorts of ways. Um, and I think one of the ways is the most essential though is that the orbit of Chiron that goes out to Uranus, right, and it
Mm-hmm.
comes into Saturn, and in Aries, Chiron's out at its own south node. It's also out at its own it's heliocentric and geocentric south node, as well as the farthest out coordinate of it orbit. It's why it takes so long to go through Aries. It's out there, in that Uranian place. And it's as far as outer space goes, it's out more near the orbit of Uranus than it is at other times. Um, and I've
Hmm.
always liked the way Melanie Reinhardt talks about Chiron functioning as this sort of intermediary of like Kuiper belt objects, and sort of like Pluto as the ultimate lord of the Kuiper belt, and these much vaster places of we can all see how Pluto feeds into power dynamics, but it's so far out there, and it's got something that has to do with these unconscious forces. Certainly things that are ancestral, not only your own personal ancestry, but collective ancestral, things like where I just feel like all these things are going on in such massive ways. Um, like the intersectionality of all the history of all these different systems and forms of oppression and wounding, and but also like there's something about Chiron that can help with nurturing something heroic in good ways, in terms of taking courage and taking your life to another level. Chiron also can function as this mentor of how to do that. But I think, and with the North Node, ultimately that's what we can do. But there's something where I feel like that deeper layer of things, we has to be worked through
Yeah.
and faced, and there's personal work. There's a lot of personal inner work that needs to be done along with whatever outer forms of work are
Yeah.
happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's definitely a stirring of the pot with that and all the things that you brought up with the certain pains and wounds and elongated storylines that are carried within this memory. Well, how do we move past it? I love what you're saying actually about Chiron being in more of its Uranian orbit area, which
Hmm
Uranus is about this point of waking up, of awakening and making progress in some way. And I think about Chiron on a high level as being very initiatory.
Mm-hmm.
And so this, especially in Aries, think about this point of initiation of the self, despite what it's been through, despite where ancestrally it comes from. What are you going to do with your energy now to move forward and to evolve and to work past things despite what's been so and we got to keep in mind that Chiron is integral into the eclipse that's coming. So let's put a pin in Chiron,
Yeah, it's a big deal.
knowing that there's something about this period that will then follow us into the eclipse. So we're gonna cruise, Gray, because we got so much to talk about here. So basically the rest of Aquarius, that was pretty much Aquarius season in a nutshell. We're already in Pisces season, actually.
Yeah,
Once I talk about this, we're already in Pisces.
Yeah.
We are already in Pisces. And of course, we're going to
I was
You're
going to say
something?
maybe you're about to say this, but that closing, the other thing that is just going on with which I think is interesting about that Mars Venus conjunction in Aquarius is just, the domicile of Saturn, and we're basically, as we go into Pisces season, we're at the end of a Saturn cycle.
Yes.
So it just reemphasizes that idea where it's sort of talking about shedding and something's kind of ending, but there's something's new. Like, what's the new thing that's going to come in? And that's the Pisces time is begins with like the end of the Saturn cycle, the beginning of a Saturn cycle.
Yeah, the end of the Saturn cycle that's emphasized by a full moon in Virgo, before, or like right as the Saturn cycle is dying, and the fact that Mercury's there too and about to make a superior conjunction with the sun, which is actually going to conjoin. It's going to be Mercury. Talk about Saturn. We're going to have a Saturn Mercury Sun moment right after that. And then having that full moon in Virgo, which is ruled by Mercury. So basically, it's Saturn Mercury Sun territory from about February 24th until the end of February, which we get a leap year. Just FYI, we are in a leap year, so we get an extra day in February. But on the 28th, we're going to have Mercury, Sun, Saturn. So that's interesting to think about, the fact that the Sun Saturn cycle starts with Mercury hanging out right there too. And I mean, any quick thoughts on that, Gray?
Yeah, could you even go one day forward to see the leap year day? I'm just curious what's
going on.
Okay, so it's right after the cycle. Yeah, I mean, that's really kind of fascinating that the leap year comes in right on that, with all the cycles coming and ending.
Comes right in on the concept of time, thinking about like Saturn and like, So,
I mean, I think the thing about this time period, it's not a whole lot different than a lot of things I feel like I was just talking about. Except that, when the sun and Saturn come together, and for the sun, for the Mercury and Saturn cycles to basically be ending and starting at the same time, it does put this great emphasis on Pisces. It's an and the Venus Mars beginning, and you can see here they're separating from Jupiter and starting to head into the Uranus square.
Piece. Yeah.
It's sort of I think just trying to get more clarity, and on one hand, it's like you'd ideally want to take this more sobering, grounded, practical, clarified approach to thing, but of course, Mercury's moving towards Neptune, and we're in this Saturn Neptune,
but we're in the Saturn Neptune place, like that's.
And so I think maybe if there's any way to get some imaginal clarity would be helpful here, and that's sort of makes me think about moving beyond fears of what can happen and just trying to sharpen your imaginal senses and ability to really envision what's possible, and what's truly possible,
Yeah. Well,
that you could really
especially,
have some pragmatic approaches to,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, and paired with the fact that Jupiter and Uranus are getting closer together and Jupiter is ruling this area, it kind of adds emphasis to that uh, understanding and breakthrough that might be coming in those areas. So, uh, yeah. So I think it's going to be a very informative moment, especially in the Pisces area of your chart and with just your relationship with Saturn. If anybody has planets that are around those areas, especially in the squares, this is kind of probably going to be a dynamic perceptive moment that starts a whole new cycle of form and boundary and endeavor, but also limitation, realizing limitations. But I feel like we're actually in a really we're in the most creative place we could possibly be when we understand our limitations, because that's the difficulty of Neptune, right? You think about like all these choices and what I can fantasize and it'd be that and be that. But if it's, you're like, you know what, that doesn't work, that has hard lines, that's not, then all of a sudden you actually can be in your most creative state because options are ruled out. It's not all conceivable, and it actually gets really practical there. So I'm kind of wondering if because that's actually the apex of the Mercury cycle, right? Think about the superior conjunction is like Mercury's collected all its information, it's got everything it needs. So how does Saturn come in and be like, all right, well, here's the new cycle, and so this is where the buck stops here, work with this, because that's your
Yeah,
best
no,
option.
this is definitely a link into some forethinking and forethought available under the water and under the water related to what's going to take shape over the next few years. Because yeah, we get the Mercury cycle starting kind of with Saturn. So Mercury's like picking up the Saturn, being reborn, and then heading straight to Neptune. So we get a connection here.
Yeah.
That's definitely going to be important. And it
So
is nice, at least, that there's a sextile. You can see here as we're moving into
yeah, to
this, like
Jupiter.
with Jupiter. Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's could be worse.
No, yeah, I think no, I think it
It's not
could be
bad.
worse. It's not bad. It's not bad.
It's not bad.
It bridges a workable gap
Yeah.
between these two, the practicality and the imagination. Like I think this is a wonderful piece to consider, especially with everything else that's going on, in the hotbed of other transits. It's like we have this piece to work with. So let's go on and move on to, so March, we're going to have our, in Pisces, we'll have our new moon in Pisces, which actually will be sextiling Uranus, which is helpful in, leading us into Jupiter, Uranus there. Of course, we're going to get Sun Neptune will happen. Sun's basically, well, that's kind of the thing too. Sun meeting Saturn, then the Sun meeting Neptune on the March 17th. Obviously, the Sun's bridging the gap of like the continual Saturn Neptune story. We also have Mercury meeting the North Node, so we're going to start to have North Node conjunctions beyond Chiron. But I really want to just bring us to the Aries ingress because there's so much to talk about Aries season that I think that we should just kind of get there. And so let's enter spring. Spring has arrived, Gray. It's March 19th, 2024, and it's 11:06 p.m. in Washington, where this chart is set. So we have our Aries ingress chart set for Washington, D.C., with a Scorpio rising. This is reminiscent of some years past where we had a Scorpio rising for the entire year, which means it's a fixed chart, at least for the United States, because we have a fixed rising. So Mars right on the IC there. Jupiter, right?
Yeah.
Jupiter, Uranus, right on the descendant. Thoughts?
Well, I just thought of something I'd looked up with Jupiter, Uranus. Let me see where I had that written down just so that I can see the actual date of it. Because there's a thing with the Jupiter Uranus cycle where it will end up coming back around after so many emanations to a similar spot. It kind of moves by degree when this happens. And so there were previously, in 1941, for example, there was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. like 26. It's kind of sort of similar. And in 1858, there's a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction at the very end of Taurus. And in 1858, when there was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction at the end of Taurus, Neptune was also in Pisces, about 25 degrees of Pisces, so fairly similar. There was this Neptune and Pisces sextile. And around the time, ballpark time of this happening is when Abraham Lincoln was running for the Senate, and he gave this very famous speech called A House Divided. And the way that that speech began was, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. And so this is obviously before he became the president, is before the Civil War. But, one of the things we talk about in the United States and what's going on right now is how polarized a lot of things are and divisive. And this definitely is, just looking at it, it does kind of echo to me that sort of idea of a house divided. Just with there's conflict at home, obviously the ruler of the ascendant, which is sort of like the people. It's Mars right on the IC. Mars is extremely angular, but so is Jupiter, Uranus. And so this definitely shows, the United States being really caught up in this Jupiter, Uranus time period in like massive ways. There's something obviously with our foreign relations, which are really important.
Yes.
But yeah, that's one of the things that that idea of like things. And then, the people, because Uranus was in Gemini when the Civil War happened and Neptune was in Aries, that's something people bring up as, concerned about the United States in the years ahead, which don't necessarily know if I believe that in terms of, I guess it depends what you mean by that, by a civil war. Certainly, though, we can see that there's lots of divisiveness, and there's different states kind of moving in different directions with what they think the laws should be. And around abortion, that's a huge thing right now. And so this just really shows like how the conflict of that, but it also shows, with Jupiter Uranus, we've already had strikes in the United States this past year. It does show this Jupiter Uranus thing coming into that's going to be really, it shows it being really a big deal here, which means that we can probably expect lots of big ways of change moving through the country in ways we may not fully understand right now.
Which I think that really piggybacks off this, moon in Leo separating from Pluto too, and the dynamic of Pluto and Aquarius, and the people being that moon, and in Leo too, which is more of a more about me. what about me in relation to the structures and the systems and the reform that's needed in that's Aquarius, is this place of reform. And so I think having the moon opposing Pluto, or coming off that opposition, really speaks to the tension that is there. And coming off of a trine of the sun too. I mean, this sun is sextile Pluto, so there is sort of this luminary energy that is like working through Pluto. The sun's coming towards it. The people in power are coming towards it. The people are leaving it, and so so there could be something that happens really big, especially with the aspects that we've seen right before the Aries ingress, that then is followed up by like, okay, well, where does the power lie? What's the and
also what we mentioned before, that Leo full moon in January kind of being configured to stuff, because you can see it returning here with not the same degree, but it still is a moon in Leo opposite Pluto, which again is sort of also foreshadowing that later Mars retrograde station at like 6, right, that will oppose Pluto. So there's like a few things where that kind of keeps getting hit, where we kind of know this is a big deal.
Yeah. Well, and to speak to what you were saying too about like reproductive rights, and maybe women's issues, etc. Here we have, because Venus has been in some precarious situations for the Aries ingresses past.
Yeah.
And so once again, she is in configuration to Saturn, but But she's exalted this time, you know, and she's she's in a better condition. She's still with Saturn, but they're friends, right? They can kind of work together here. But I mean, any thoughts about Venus, Saturn in a fifth house, at least by whole signs, by the whole sign chart, that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be more positive about abortion and reproductive rights, and but I'm also not, I guess, as expert at mundane astrology as far as tracking that issue through
Yeah.
time, and this might, maybe there's something. I mean, on this, just looking at it, that looks hard. Of course, Venus hitting Saturn, but you know, the thing about Venus and Saturn, though, I guess, just to kind of step out of that thing with like mundane current events, there might be some hard stuff around that. But I think, just if you think about personally, you know, Venus and Saturn can really create beautiful forms of art together, you know, where you have that like constraint and thing of Saturn. Like you're showing here, there is a mutual reception with Jupiter that's taking place, for Venus is in the sign of Jupiter and Jupiter's in the sign of Venus, and they're coming into a sextile. So, you know, maybe there's something there where that Jupiter coming in with Uranus is like helping to, you know, revolutionize and
Yeah.
and help break Venus out of that the harsher constraints of Saturn. So
I
I mean,
know.
it could go that way. Yeah. I mean, certainly this seems to indicate some kind of big waves of movements and stuff happening with the United States, for sure, with
Yeah.
Jupiter, Uranus so angular.
Yeah, so that's what, you know, just a kind of a quick summary of what's going on in the ingress chart for the year. Definitely some dynamics, but let's continue into Aries season just in general, because it is probably April just in general. It's a hot spot. It's the hot spot or one of them of 2024. So,
Yeah, this,
well,
when we hit the Aries equinox and moving into this whole Aries time, this is when the astrology gets very disruptive, hectic, volatile. Things are really charged. Stuff's going to be happening. That's something to kind of be ready for.
be ready, people, because
Yeah.
this is where the movement is. And obviously things are going to probably really kick off with March 25th. We have a lunar eclipse in Libra. With that, and I mean, that's going to be ruled by that Venus Saturn action, and then Venus is still in that mutual reception with Jupiter. So there is that back and forth there, but we're having that culmination of, you know, we had our solar eclipse in Libra back in the fall, which was very, you know, Libra season and a Scorpio season 2023, and Gray and I had talked about this in our previous forecasts, in the initial one and our recap during the spring or the summer, that was the hot spot period of 2023, and people definitely felt it. So here we're having the lunar eclipse, not the same lunar eclipse version of that per se, but there is this illumination of that Libra and that Venus component. And Jupiter and Uranus getting closer and closer together, with Venus configured there. And then Mars also being in Pisces now, so that you know, everybody kind of going on to Jupiter's. There's some Jupiter team. There's like a ping pong action between Jupiter and Venus's mutual reception basically going on, as far as like just planetary rulership is concerned. So any thoughts you wanted to share on this?
Yeah. I mean, one of the main things was obviously being the eclipse, like you're saying, and there's the Venus Saturn moving in with, you know, moving with Jupiter and Uranus to Neptune, but there is also the Mars Saturn. And so I had written down, hopefully this is correct, it's basically March 22nd to April 30th is, I believe, the time period of a little over a month where Mars is in Pisces along with Saturn and Neptune. So this is one of the things where I think one of the things that's been really emphasized in astrology since 2020, when we had Mars go into Capricorn and setting off that whole Saturn Pluto dynamic, is and we've seen in other previous years before that, but how difficult, Mars Saturn can be. And Mars Saturn is another one of the great cycles of astrology that astrologers look at, but it's usually what people are looking at for in terms of like the problems and what's
The problem,
difficult.
yeah.
Yeah. And so it is interesting. It makes me think back to 2022 when we had the Jupiter Neptune conjunction in Pisces, which was really exciting, but it coincided with Mars and Saturn being together in Aquarius. And this
Mhm.
year, it's like that we have the Jupiter, Uranus, and Taurus, which can get excited about the possibility, but it's coinciding with Mars and Saturn in Pisces, and then it's Mars and Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. So I think some of the water issues and some of the more difficult issues connected with Saturn, Neptune are going to be coming in during
To
this
play
this this
here.
month. Yeah.
Yeah.
While at the same time we're getting, and I'm remembering then that Mars is ruling the solar eclipse. Um, and Mars is one of the nodal rulers, so it's starting here. By March 20, Mars has just recently gotten into Pisces, so it'll be building, but we'll already be starting to feel like what's this Mars Saturn issue that we're going to be dealing with starting to come up here.
So it almost feels like to me, actually, that uh, this particular Libra eclipse isn't too hairy, but it's almost like it's like maybe the sweet spot before
Mm.
things start to kind of hit the fan
Well,
a
it is
little
interesting,
bit.
yeah, too, that it's in the domicile of Venus and the exaltation of Saturn, and that they're, so close together.
Configured, yeah.
Yeah, there's really something about this that's really emphasizing this Mars, Saturn, Venus, Neptune dynamic. And then also we're like basically which I'm sure you're about to say, but we're also Mercury's in Aries, sign of
Yeah.
Mars, and Mercury's slowing down here, but a week later it goes retrograde. I think around
So
April 2nd or
but
so.
it's actually technically it's April 1st, which I thought was
Okay.
really funny just because it's April Fool's Day. And so I'm like, what? There'll be extra fools out with Mercury
Hmm.
stationing on April Fool's Day. But there's something to be said for what Gray's talking
That's
about
right.
here because
Yeah.
we are in the eclipse vortex as they call it. And the whole time we got a slowing Mercury that then goes to station, and then Mercury is going to be retrograde during some serious planetary action, which has happened before. I don't think it was last year, but maybe the year before that we had during eclipse season. God, was it when eclipses were happening? And I can't remember if it was Taurus, Scorpio, or Gemini, Sag, but there was a hot spot eclipse season that was happening while Mercury was retrograde the entire time. But this is that first taste, right, of a full fire retrograde in Aries. Why we're about to have an eclipse. I mean, look at the sun getting close to the North Node there. Chiron, Mars and Saturn getting closer and closer. I'm
Yeah,
just gonna,
and Jupiter and Uranus are getting about 3 degrees away too, so
yeah,
that's really
they're really
intensifying.
close.
So this is,
So
yeah, this is a, yeah, I mean, there's going to be probably some issues and things you just got to deal with that are not necessarily going to be pleasant during this Mercury retrograde, but it also, with any time of great difficulty in the world, or even if you're facing stuff yourself, I guess one of the things that makes me think of is with that Jupiter Uranus simultaneously coming together, that can be, great agents of change, like
yes,
necessity being the mother of invention, and
yes.
that it can just coincide with like what's just kind of part of like pushing you to the next place, right? And where you're going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so the first thing that comes to mind for me, Gray, is just thinking back to that kind of like the quandary of the spirit. And, maybe there are a lot of things happening in the world, and a lot of things happening around you, but there's this internal process going on about like, okay, well, who am I? Where am I going? What do I want out of life? What do I need to change within my physical world? Think about Jupiter, Uranus. Like if you want to like kind of destruct something that is very fixed in your life that's not working on for a spiritual angle, this is the time when you start to feel that hot spot of action versus reaction versus no action and where you know, and then the Chiron story there. I've obviously, like, if you're watching the video, I have fast forwarded us to April 8th, where our total solar eclipse is going to happen, because I feel like we should spend some time here in the interest of saving time. Because I know Gray and I, we love to talk for the first like 4 months, 5 months, and all of a sudden we have to speed read through the
Yeah.
rest of the year. So yeah, I think the fact that Mercury's retrograde in Aries fire, while Mars Saturn, like you said, because it will bring up the difficulty, it will bring up, but also the whole new cycle of what are, you know, what are you doing? What's your plan?
Mhm.
Where are you putting your energy? What, that's also breeding here too.
Yeah, and I kind of want to just not even talk about. I mean, mundane events could be some difficult things, and we definitely could also see, you know, it's a Jupiter Uranus time, which can be oftentimes these big emancipatory, liberating movements coming in. Saturn Pisces not necessarily great for authority figures. Saturn Neptune often brings down authority systems. So Sun at exaltate close to its exaltation degree, getting eclipse. Definitely, we could see some leaders falling, or
Yeah.
celebrities are difficult, or so. But on a personal level, one of the things I was just starting to think about is, you know, we're talking a lot about what do you want to create, what do you want to give birth to, and you know, I have not had the experience of having a human life in my body, and giving birth to a child, but I've only been in the room when that's happened, and was able to, you know, be the person catching, you know,
Catching.
my two daughters. I got to be the person
You're
receiving
the
them
ride
into the
receiver.
world. Yeah, being the receiver of them. Um, and but honestly, it's a you know, life-threatening even experience, for women to give birth. It's in that idea of like birth, and you know, the constriction, and but then giving birth to this form, and then how that changes your life
Mm.
irrevocably, and the level of responsibility and accountability, you know, you have to step into, which I just think has something to do with, you know, Mars and Saturn. This is like the only way I can positively reframe some of this stuff, is just like thinking about that. Like, what are you wanting to give birth to? You know, you're gonna have to take responsibility. You have to step up to be, you know, the person, you know, you want your child to have as their parental figure. And so I think there's something metaphorical or symbolic about this in a way. um I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just something
Well,
I just started thinking about
no,
looking at
I
it.
love that. I mean, that really, just that first breath of life, and thinking about that Aries, that Aries energy, and just thinking about Mars Saturn together, and the fact that that whole, you know, 2-year cycle is ruled by essentially the Jupiter Uranus conjunction. You know, since it's in Pisces, there's something really dynamic about the two coming together there, and this being infused into the eclipse. Like, I can feel, I like, to me, I feel like this 6 month, like, just the generic 6 month period, of course, you know, depending on the time of the eclipse and how long it eclipses, tells us the length of the eclipse affects itself. But if we were just to, you know, throw the generic of the 6 months until the next eclipse cycle, like, I feel like we can see some like radical shifts, radical changes all over the board, and especially in our personal lives. Like, if you've been waiting to make that move, or start this thing, or become this, or sell that, or leave that, or, you know, like, this is to me, this is where the risk of the birth takes place, and you have
Yeah,
to let go of things
mm,
and leave things behind in the Pisces fashion. And the real world shakes up and crumbles, but also has new momentum and progress with the Jupiter and Uranus. But yeah, so it's
yeah,
it's a
totally.
duality.
Yeah, and I'm realizing I didn't speak this, but when I was thinking about the giving birth to, you know, a child, is that it's also it's difficult. I mean, not just that, but just how
Yeah.
it changes your life. You know, you can no longer do um whatever you want to, you know, the way that changes your life. And exhaustion, and but it's like it's to this purpose. It's there is like this actual higher purpose of what you are then nurturing, and it's what makes
Mm.
that all the sacrifices that are part of that
Yes.
so meaningful. And then you know, and in my life we were speaking, I mean I've been working I've never been a full-time professional astrologer, and I've always had a full-time job that I've been working, which is actually connected back to helping to give birth to those two daughters of mine, and always feeling like I need to be having a full-time job to make more money. And but I am actually right now ending that job. So at the beginning of the new year, I'm going to become a full-time astrologer. So for when I just think of myself as an example, and looking at this, and I have a Pisces 10th house, and you know, to actually then to leave one career, become your own, run your own, you know, for example, with astrology, being a full-time astrologer, there's so much work involved in that and responsibility you have to take. And so there's a sort of thing here where I think there's a lot of change coming, but there's also like you're gonna have to put in work and accountability, kind of stand up for what you want to see happen. But it's not, it's like I'm saying, it's involving a lot of work and effort and sacrifices and
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Which you'll have mixed feelings about because it's Pisces. And so it's not like it's a strong Mars. It's like, okay, we're gonna do this. It's like this is the first time in a handful of years that we had Mars Saturn meet, not in Saturn's domicile. So there is that too, where not to say that it lessens the Mars Saturn energy, but it has a different component in it. You know, the hard work is in service to the growth, is in service to the Jupiter Uranus piece. So we're just going to show up. We're going to show up when we can. We're going to show up when we feel like it. We're going to learn to rest when we need to, because I think that's a big component of, you know, being effective in this world, like, especially with all the Aries, like eclipse energy. It's like, you know, come in hot, burst in, do it. But it's like you don't want to be a flash in the pan with your big dream. You gotta, you gotta pace yourself.
Mm.
So that's, yeah,
Mm.
there's that momentum. So we're going to move on, Gray, because we got lots to talk about
Yeah.
here. So I'm just going to kind of cycle through. And as I
Yeah.
say things, Gray, if there's
I
something
think
that
you
you're
can
just interject.
I think
Yeah.
that's a great idea, just to move into the next thing.
Yeah.
I
So
mean, one thing that's happening, I could say about that, that's happening here is Venus is hitting that 15-degree separation from the sun around here. So
oh,
she'll
yeah.
still be visible, but if we're going to use traditional under the beams, she's like kind of going into it around. And that's going to be something where we go through this long extended thing that's, you know, it's not till Gemini time that she hits that conjunction with the sun. And then later when she's in Leo that she'll come out and be visible again. But we're kind of moving into Venus going into the disappearing here. And
Yeah. So yeah, put
at
her
the
in a
same time,
pin. No,
at the
she's
same time,
changing.
Mercury is in the underworld, and like you're showing her about to
Yeah.
be
So, but
regenerated and stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
So basically we reach Mars, Saturn, and then we meet you know, the Mercury Cazimi, inferior Cazimi, on April 11th. Yeah, so there's just a lot. And then the moon is going really, you know, that whole time right
Yeah.
after the eclipse, the moon goes over Jupiter Uranus for the last time
Yeah.
before it separates. Like, you like that eclipse the first couple of days, it's like, wow, things are happening. And I think that really just
Mhm.
adds to the potency of what you were just saying too, Gray, about Venus starting her next, you know, a whole elongated endeavor, especially since she is part of the whole eclipse story.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's big. And speaking of Venus, you know, she's going to go on, she's going to conjunct the North Node on the in mid April, and then of
Hmm.
course we make it to the 20th when we have Jupiter Uranus, which we've talked a great deal about. I don't know if you want to go into it any further or if there's anything you would like to
Well,
add.
yeah, there's the one thing I thought we could mention, and if you have anything on this, is just to think about. I mean, I threw out, and you did too, like big historical events, but what we can often see too is that there can be a successive, you go from one to the other. So the other one was back in 2010, 2011. It was at the end of Pisces. It was at the beginning of Aries. So there could be something now that in your personal life is coming up again. I know for myself, actually, what's interesting about me becoming a full-time astrologer now was that last conjunction was a time period where I was making a lot more. It was a period of me putting a lot more steps into starting to do more astrology readings. And I went to like my first conference soon after that conjunction. And I was kind of like more entering, becoming like, I'm going to start being an astrologer at the last one. And this one, I'm going to actually be like fully stepping into that. But if just I just looked up, I was like, what were some of the things that happened at the last one? So, with social media, things like Instagram and Kickstarter came up then. That's when the iPad was released. And, you think the iPad does facilitate a lot of like artistic, creative work in interesting ways. In 2011, even I think Siri was like announced and came out, and there were some other things like the first truly synthetic organism and a molecular robot created from DNA also came out around that time, and some things where you can sort of see how like that would be kind of thematically lining up with like AI. There were like 3D camcorders that came out, things that didn't totally catch on, but when we talk about now and like virtual reality things coming in, we can see how those things are coming in more. Like there was a Google driverless car, electric car charging stations, an idea of like road embedded rechargers. Things where like but probably the most massive thing is one of the most massive things when we're talking about like things really catching fire was like literally the Arab Spring, which is somebody like lighting themselves on fire and completely changing the whole face of things in ways that nobody could have known. So that the Arab Spring being something that I don't know if we'll have something that potent again, but these are the types of things I mentioned too, like the United States Revolution, the French Revolution, were previous alignments, but the last alignment was the Arab Spring. It also kind of fit into when we had the Occupy Wall Street movement, was sort of like right as that new cycle was beginning. So yeah, just you can think back to 2010, 2011 as another element of this, because that was the last time they came together.
Yeah. Well, the only research that I have like before me was actually research that I did on Jupiter Uranus in 1858 when they actually met in Taurus.
Yeah.
To get some Taurus flavor vibes. I think one of the most entertaining aspects of that was actually that's when Borden Inc. was founded, which is a primary dairy and food distributor, and they ended up creating Elmer's glue, which is actually, out of milk. It's a milk product. And you think about the bull and Taurus, etc. So that was like a little fun fact. They ended up creating crazy glue, which is very Jupiter, Uranus, and Taurus, I think. One of the things that was a big aspect that created a lot of tension in the financial world, both in America and Britain, was actually these bank charter acts that I think first started in Britain, but then came here in the US, is the issue of paper money not being backed by gold and silver. So it's like the worth, what is the money and what is the worth behind it, because they were printing all this stuff, and it's like, well, what is it backed by? And the requirement to actually have the gold and silver and the reserves to be backed up with the amount of money that's in the circulation. And that was actually created. There was something called the Panic of 1857, which was a financial panic that happened in the United States, which caused a declining international economy and an overexpansion of the domestic economy. And It was basically, it was actually, what's interesting about it was the first financial crisis that spread through the United States. And it was because it was more interconnected in the world sphere. And so we think about, Jupiter and more of the expansive element of it in the world stage. And now and how, especially in this day and age, when we are so aligned and connected with all the markets and all the different currencies and even the digital currencies, and
Hmm.
there's bound to be something that comes out that taps in to the future of that and how that might be changing, and where there might be some holes and flaws in the system of value just in general, especially thinking about, I know we didn't really talk about this, Gray, but like the conjunction happens with Venus in her detriment on Chiron, like that it's backed by a Venus that is um not in the best state ever, and especially going, as you said, starting to enter her relationship with the sun. Um
Yeah,
so
she's
yeah,
setting.
so she's another fascinating thing that happened then too was there was actually a religious revival that happened during this period of Jupiter Uranus, that there's a religious revival actually in relation to a prayer meeting for businessmen so that they had the access to pray during their lunches, and it created this whole widespread movement of religion within paired with business and so that people could take the time out of their work to have like this religious sort of, and he built this massive following. It's just, yeah, so there's lots of things
There's
to
another one
share
that
here.
year. This is just really quick. Would be the Darwin and Wallace publishing that theory of
Mm,
evolution, which I think when we're talking about how
yeah.
that one speaks to me in terms of in 1858, like we mentioned before, the other key thing about that was not only was at the end of Taurus, but Neptune was actually in Pisces in a fairly similar degree. So there is something interesting when you just bring up that religion. Like in the case of Darwin, it was actually really countering a lot of these like religious narratives about the way things are. Um, with a theory of evolution that starts shifting people's perspectives. But at the same time, and there could be big things going on like that that are really obvious. In Cosmos and Psyche, Rick Tarnas mentions an important point being that in 1858, people didn't actually when Darwin announces this, it wasn't really people didn't fully recognize how important it was at the time. I mean, it obviously became a huge thing, but it wasn't so obvious right then in the moment. But it's like this thing coming in that's going to start changing everything. Yeah.
Well, and that just
Oh,
goes
then
back to the
you have it
same
there. Yeah.
themes we were talking about
Hmm.
earlier. And so that's
Yeah.
actually really a point to drive home here, I think, Gray, is to think about
Hmm.
what happens in 2024 and its impact on a larger scale in the future. So maybe don't, I mean, obviously things will be happening this year, but there's a big impact where it's like, look behind the scenes, look at the foreshadowing, because we'll see it. Um, much later on. So, all right. Well, we should probably
Yeah. We can
keep this train a
we should keep
rolling.
going. Yeah.
Keep this train a rolling. Bring my notes back here. Got so many different screens
We
up.
could jump to the next. I don't know if you want to do the next full moon, but or just
Yeah.
jump even
So,
past that if you want. I mean,
yeah. Let me get back on my schedule. Let me get back on my schedule here. Oh, we did have. Yeah. Well, that's interesting with the full moon. We'll just touch on it. We'll just touch real quick, just a couple days later, because we're still in eclipse zone, right? Like we got to think
mhm.
about that. Let's get through our full moon with the eclipse cycle, and this is significant because it's going to be a full moon in Scorpio, and it's going to be squaring Pluto, right? We get another hit of Pluto in Aquarius during this time period. We also got Mars ruling this full moon in sandwiched between Saturn and Neptune.
Yeah.
So, so this could also be foreshadowing in the sense of there will be a dynamic new moon that's going to be coming in Scorpio later in the year, and there's also the obviously the eclipse that's going to light up Neptune here too. So, and we know Scorpio full moons are always, they always hand us something.
Yeah, and the
So
other thing is about a week, so you can see that full moon separating from the square with Pluto and Aquarius, which is really big, and it's it's kind of heading to the Jupiter Uranus, and then it's interesting that it's really connecting a lot of stuff. It's connecting the Pluto and Aquarius. It's then trining the Saturn Pisces stuff, and then it's like going to oppose the Jupiter Uranus. But I might be wrong on the date because I'm realizing on some of these dates. I wrote a forecast for Ignota Press that's in the United Kingdom, and so I know some of my dates are actually except for England instead of Eastern time zone. But around May 2nd, May 1st, maybe Pluto stations retrograde, and I think that's just the other big thing to mention. And that's roughly a little bit over a week later after this full moon. So there is something where Pluto's about to go retrograde here.
yeah,
We're at the outer, that's as far as Pluto's really going to go into Aquarius, and this full moon like hits it, so that's significant.
yeah. So, okay, so we're reaching, and we've left the like all systems go with obviously Mercury going retrograde, but here we get the next retrograde of an elongated retrograde, right? So that's not just like a quick sort of Mercury thing. And obviously Jupiter or Pluto is very important in the astrology of this year, and the fact this full moon lights it up right before it goes retrograde on the 2nd, on May 2nd there. And so let's go. So we're in Taurus season now. Mars basically dances with Neptune. And then we have basically almost simultaneously, we have Mars and Venus both in domicile at the beginning of May. So we got, Mars is going to do its Aries transit, which is going to be impactful, obviously, because Mars is going to, during May, it's going to conjunct the solar eclipse point essentially around May 19th through the 26th is sort of like that hot spot of activation for various reasons. And then we have Venus in her sign doing her thing. We also have, that's when May 3rd is when Neptune enters 29 degrees Pisces and is sitting there. So now we get this flavor of the anaretic Neptune that's coming into view. A couple days later, Venus essentially becomes combust at that time, with her getting close enough to the sun, where she is officially putting on her sunscreen and getting ready.
Yeah. So that's a nice place to start. 'Cause I was going to say that I would just jump ahead to where you went, which is basically like this new moon that's coming in. But even this dark moon, waning moon here is interesting with, like you're mentioning, Venus is disappearing, going combust, and then here comes the dark moon. So, but at the same time, we have Jupiter, Uranus still starting their cycle, and then also, the sun is also close. The Jupiter cycle is also coming to an end, where with Jupiter setting and into invisibility, and Jupiter also going combust. And so there's yeah, it's just but the new moon that comes right after this, there is it's very close to the Jupiter Uranus, and
Get that up.
yeah, this is definitely another big like inception moment of the year here.
Yeah, so May 7th, we're gonna have that Jupiter, Uranus, Sun, Moon, Venus party, all in Taurus there. And so it does put a hyper focalized energy onto the Taurus area of your chart, and all the dynamic twists and turns and shifts and growing pains that have and growing pleasures, I guess we could say, with Venus there too, that are taking place. So yeah, this, and then Mercury is it's about to leave its shadow at this point too. So it's sort of like encapsulates a time period that, time period that we just went through is ending. This new one is beginning, as new moons tend to do, but this does it in like kind of a different, different sort of chapter.
Hmm.
Yeah, so we are, it's not going to be as dynamic. Well, I don't want to say that. Who knows? That things are dynamic in people's lives for different reasons, but we are leaving, we have left that April territory, and well, no, that's not, I'm retract, because I got to take us over to Mars. I think this is going to be
Yeah, because then we
very
also have Mars
significant.
coming to the north. Mars coming to the north
North
node in
node
Aries.
on the
Yeah,
18th. Yeah. And so I think that's why
yeah.
I had this whole period. And then the moon opposing it. So we basically get Moon Mars nodal
And it's a Jupiter.
action.
The Jupiter cycle is
Is
being
yes,
reanimated and
yes.
reseated right here too. So Jupiter's dying and being reborn right as Mars comes in there. So this
Yeah.
could, I mean, there's some, yeah, it could be some shaky stuff in the world. I'm curious if people because I'm not an economic astrologer. There's probably, I'm imagining something significant about this time period, and it may not be necessarily favorable. I don't know. But I can only think about it in personal ways, and that's that I think the strength of Mars coming to the North Node with Chiron still in the vicinity is again really stuff we've already been talking about, like putting a premium on like what do you really want to be doing and creating, directionality with your life and getting more focused and excited about that. And then Jupiter is being like reanimated at the same time. So there's like what's like the underlying vision, and it's not just like blind, like I'm just gonna go after and make this happen. Like what's the deeper vision to direct that Mars North node?
Yeah. Yeah. Because, yeah, I mean, well, and we get that Jupiter. Did we get, no, because the last Sun Jupiter was in Aries, obviously. Uh,
And it's
so
a
here
Venus
we,
Uranus time too. I guess we didn't mention that.
I
We should have
know.
said that
So
it's like Venus
yeah,
Uranus too.
they're
So
all
there's a
together.
real, yeah, it's powerful.
It's powerful in just relation to the Sun Jupiter synodic cycle, right? Because that
Hmm.
is essentially what this whole cycle is birthed under, is this Venus Uranus action, it being close to Jupiter and the sun, Mars on the North Node. So just think about that, not in the terms of just this particular moment on, now May 18th and the last bit of May, but for the entire year of, Sun Jupiter related action. It's under this very dynamic, which speaks to speaks back to Gray, actually, the birth. And like
Mm.
the manifestation quality, and probably why you keep drawing the magician in your life, is
But
that
it also makes me think that that's close to the degree of well, it's definitely in the vicinity of the stars in the Pleiades. Star
mm,
Alcyone or Alcyone is like very beginning of Gemini. But the Pleiades sometimes are associated with like blindness and losing your vision, but they're also connected to like deep vision and relations with spirits and being able to see on this, maybe one type of vision is brought down to accentuate this other vision of seeing much more deeper in some ways into these like underlying and more invisible, more seemingly invisible to most people dynamics. And yeah, there's something about that I think is interesting with it also being Venus, Uranus, just like, in Venus and Jupiter, they're coming together, but we can't see them. They're invisible. But even though there's this invisibility going on here, there's a really deep visioning that's available to really to get to. Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, not all growth happens in the light. there's a there's something to be said about the receptive nature of a quiet expansion. I don't think it'll be that quiet, but I mean, a lot of what we go through on the internal plane is just as dynamic, if not more dynamic, to how it's realized. So Let us go on actually
Yeah.
to we got big moves. We got big moves closing out May. And as we leave go into Gemini season, we have Jupiter moving into Gemini on May 25th. So yeah, there is obviously this is going to be a big shift. We got Jupiter moving into it's technically its sign of detriment. It's going to be in Mercury's sign, so Jupiter is not necessarily traditionally at home in this place, but it still does Jupiter things just in Mercury's sign.
Yeah, and Jupiter does like being in air signs. And so
That's
I know
true.
some people get down on Jupiter and Gemini, but it's not actually like Jupiter literally has nothing going for it in Taurus. There's nothing about, unless there's a section of the bounds that Jupiter has, but
Yeah,
otherwise there's nothing Jupiter has of any form of essential dignity in Taurus. And Jupiter does rule the first decan of Gemini, and the entire sign is an air element, which Jupiter likes.
yeah. So
So
that's great.
I
I
think there's
mean,
actually like
something to work with.
there is. I mean, more so I feel like than theoretically than in Taurus even like just out of essential dignity, gaining some triplicity is a real thing. And
Yeah.
now it does mean Jupiter's in a domicile of Mercury, and so all of Mercury's movements
I
and
know.
going retrograde and all of that,
Is going to
you know,
affect Jupiterian
it comes in.
things.
But
Yeah.
I think, I just, if you're just being really strict on essential dignity, I mean, Jupiter Gemini has, and it's like Jupiter and Virgo, which, is the earth element, and as well as its opposite home. Gemini having that triplicity, and in the first decan, I think it's
Yeah.
something.
It's more well suited for this area than other
And
areas
the fact
even.
that we're with Pluto's in Aquarius, right? So we get the
The
trine
Pluto
to Pluto
trine.
coming right
Hmm.
away, and the emphasis on the air signs. Um, there's a Gemini quality here that's really important that comes in, and I mean, I think that with Jupiter in Gemini, you just gotta kind of watch the like getting too displaced and dispersed and too much all over
All over
the
the
shop
place.
with too
Yeah.
many ideas, and you know but there's
Yeah. I
it
have
goes so well with technological
it
innovation
does. It
and
does.
new creative literary ideas and or potential creative movements that there's definitely I think a lot that can come out with this Jupiter and Gemini
Yeah.
period. Yeah.
I found it interesting last time we had Jupiter and Gemini. We the popularity of MOOCs, massive open online courses, was growing during
Hmm.
this period. So platforms like Coursera, Udacity, edX, basically all these online course, they were
Hmm.
free offerings from universities and institutions. But we've seen like the boom of online education that's happened in the last 12 years. So thinking about the next level, especially when we're thinking about, things like primary education and like the initiative, like during that time of when Jupiter was last in Gemini too, of digital learning and how they were trying to
Hmm.
needed to upgrade the technology in the school systems to kind of keep up, especially now that we're in the air age. So there will probably be innovations with maybe adding like AI dynamics and all these
Hmm.
other aspects to the educational experience, especially on a more primary level. There was also the time, the last Jupiter in Gemini, when a bunch of countries started to emphasize the STEM education, which is a focus on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, to make sure that kids were being taught, obviously, foreshadowing
Hmm.
what is continually more and more important. Not to say that it's rightfully so, that that's more and more important, but it has become the world that we live in. Um, and then same with even back in 1965, because 1965, as we go into, I've been looking back there because that is the last time we had Jupiter in Gemini and also squaring Saturn in Pisces. Actually, in a really long span of history, it's not a very common thing. But there was also themes that of 1965 too about Elementary and Secondary Education Act that helped get federal funding and educational opportunities for disadvantaged students, students that were in need. And same with the Higher Education Act that happened then too. That was actually the start of the creating grants and loan programs to make college more accessible to people. And even the Head Start program, which was launched during this period, which was part of to provide early childhood education and health and nutrition and parental involvement services to low income families and children, which is to me is very Gemini Pisces dynamic. So and I think those are all wonderful things that came out of Jupiter and Jupiter Saturn, squaring off. So those are just some shares.
Yeah, that's great. And then the other thing is just to think in very general, it's going to take a bit for Jupiter actually square Saturn, not to like
Yes,
middle
it's
of
not right out the
August.
gate.
But there we start getting that whole sign square from the tropical zodiac, as well as even with Neptune. I mean, and then Jupiter Neptune square does not come into effect completely this year, but because Jupiter only gets up to about like 20 or so Gemini, but that's something too. So there's yeah, the way we have the Saturn Neptune closing down and Jupiter going into the sign squaring it starts creating a lot of dynamic more dynamic tension there, I guess. And
Yeah,
where I
between the
would,
mutable.
and with the trine to Pluto and Aquarius and being in this air age that Gemini is very part of, like I would definitely expect, like you're describing, there are lots of innovations, especially because as you're about to show, it's also the Gemini Venus. So Venus coming in with her superior conjunction in Gemini, which very beautifully, as you're showing here, for people that are watching the video, is also lining up with Mercury
And
going into
Jupiter.
Gemini and combining with Jupiter. And we're also, Venus is invisible, sort of in the underworld, being regenerated by the sun, but Jupiter here is starting to become visible. So there is
Mm,
and then we're coming into like a new moon in Gemini, which is going to be a really important moment here too. So yeah, this is to me one of the big things about this quarter of the year is this Gemini time period here. So we have this big kind of hyper Taurus period, and then we move into this big hyper Gemini
I know it's like
time
hyper
period.
Aries, hyper Taurus, hyper,
Yeah.
like
But it's all square Saturn is the other thing. And then,
yes.
then they'll all move from squaring Saturn into Neptune. So um yeah, it's there's definitely something it's not just like do whatever you want, Gemini, completely free form.
No.
There's this Saturn resistance and constraint and tension that has to be met. And I think there's something about Gemini, when we're talking about Saturn, Neptune in general, you can see here they're getting to be about 11 degrees. They're getting closer to about as close as they get this year. But they're coming into like a 11, 10-degree range here. So many things, dissolving, people's beliefs changing, and people maybe being more unclear with boundaries about what's real, what's not real, and who even knows the technological inventions and changes that happened between now and this time period. But I do, yeah, this new moon coming in at the same time we have a new Venus cycle starting. I actually like this in terms of the Gemini ability, I guess, just to be really not just curious, but able to be flexible as needed, able to take different sources of information, different types of things happening, and synthesize things together, find some kind of mixture, problem solve as needed, be open to the change of direction that's needed. I guess that side of Gemini. that sort of crafty, real cunning, this real cunningness of Gemini is going to be needed here.
Well, I think this actually just illustrates the time of year based on everything that's happened with the eclipses, Jupiter and Uranus, et cetera, where we need that flexibility. We need that flexibility of the mind and the possibilities within, once again, the constraints, and the paths that get blocked off versus the options that are still available. And then how do you get clever within all that, and especially with Mercury and Jupiter having just been configured, and Mercury being, I mean, it's not that far from the sun, so it's in domicile, so it's not the best Mercury, but it's not the worst Mercury, and so it feels like there's just something to work with perceptually as far as just getting a grasp on where things are going and the ideas you have and the possibilities. So it'll be mercurial in nature, and it'll be a lot of things might be thrown our way, but I don't know. I kind of like it. Starting to really feel that Gemini. We're going to start to really feel that Jupiter and Gemini start to take place, which is going to be a totally different vibe. It's going to be a totally different vibe.
And it's worth saying, if you have Gemini, significant things of
Yes.
Gemini in your chart, this is just a massive place of developments and changes, not star needed here to combine with the new moon.
Yeah.
Really.
So
big
really,
for
so
us
really,
Gemini people, which
yeah. So
I'm in include mix. Yeah.
My internet was getting all weird. I think hopefully it's stabilized out. Oh, we'll give it a couple seconds.
Well, I could hear you the whole time.
You can hear me? Yeah. Mercury knew we were talking about it, and all right.
Yeah, I can hear you. I mean,
I hear you, but
I think the thing that
your
happens right
video is
after this,
frozen.
if you need a figure. Oh,
now,
okay.
You said, yeah.
Well, hopefully that's the case.
It's like it's bringing you in
I
like
can
pictures.
See you're not up for me, but
yeah, you're like coming in like still frames
okay.
where it's actually really funny. You'll have one face, and then you'll turn to the next one and the next one. Oh wait, you're slowly piecing back. All right, well, we'll just hope it fixes itself as long as we can hear each other fine.
I think your people are peering behind the curtain of my Gemini multiplicity. It's like
the Gemini
different
multiplicity
sides of myself.
Yeah, it's just coming in.
So I think the thing that happens, I don't know if you're about to say that,
Yeah.
is Mars going into Taurus to square Pluto.
Yes. So Mars squaring Pluto around June 11th, give or take, while we have the Super Gemini party going on. Yeah, so that will obviously be a dynamic moment in the Pluto story and in the Mars story, in the world stage story, in the how we take all those ideas and how that manifests in the actual enacting of them in the real world and changes that need to be made. So that will be a hot spot. I do want to just sort of like I'm just gonna rocket forward basically, Gray, to like get us to some more of like the really meaty stuff.
Great.
So I'm just gonna so we're gonna have a full moon in Capricorn. Where we go here. Next thing I see here is full moon in Capricorn, right near the solstice. So we kind of go into summer
right
in the northern hemisphere. Yeah, we get that kind of solstice with that full moon energy. And then not too long after,
and there's basically two full moons in Capricorn, right? So that's a big thing too, because we get that early Capricorn full moon. I'm pretty sure there's I think so. Do the next one just so I don't.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
How did I miss that?
29.
How did I miss that? Which this one? this one. But yeah.
Yeah, it's
So
really close to Pluto. So I mean, you can see that we're heading
yeah, it's
by
the
the end
sun
of
Pluto.
Cancer. Yeah, the end of Cancer ends with this full moon conjunct Pluto, but
But we can't get here too
technically
quick.
Capricorn.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just know that like we're in Cancer time, but there's two Capricorn full moons, so there's a big the Capricorn part of your chart really gets the
Yeah.
beginning and the end of it get really get impacted here.
Yeah, and you might think back not to this past year, but in 2022, no, 2021, we had two back-to-back Aquarius full moons with that same energy, and it really does bring that area of your life home. Like it starts a
Mhm.
chapter, it culminates the start of a chapter, and then it culminates the end of a chapter. So definitely prepare for that. But basically we're going to have June is closed out with Saturn having stationed retrograde on the 29th there. And Neptune also stations retrograde on July 2nd. So we have more stations taking place. You know, at this point, we have Saturn, Neptune, Pluto. I think that might be it, but still, that's a lot. That's a lot of planets going retrograde here. We have our new moon in Cancer on July 5th that you see on the screen here. And so that will be dynamic, obviously, because this is our turning point with eclipse seasons. Once again, we have that that new moon pivot point of eclipse energies happening.
That's
And it's
also
going to be with
happening. Oh,
Mhm.
sorry.
I was
I
going
was
to
gonna say
say
Neptune stationing retrograde basically is like right before
right
that.
before
So
it. Yeah.
you mentioned Saturn's at the end of June, and then because they're kind of in this getting close to each other. So we're getting this thing now where Saturn and Neptune stations are not too far away from each other. So end of June, Saturn stations, beginning of July, Neptune stations, new moon. There's going to be big Saturn Neptune themes of
Yeah.
Pisces that really come in right here with this new moon. Yeah.
Yeah. And this new moon, it's also configured to Saturn and Mars both loosely, but well, not that loose. So in a flowing dynamic. So there's something to be said about this entire lunar cycle, right? Because it is encapsulated between those full moons in Capricorn, and we're about to have a lot of dynamic action take place in just July in general. July has definitely some hotspot moments when it comes to when it comes to the Pluto piece, right? Because let's keep cycling through here.
Yeah.
On July 12th, we've got Venus moving into Leo, and she is going to oppose Pluto then. So she's at her halfway point after her and Mars met earlier in the year there. She's not quite out of her relationship with the sun yet. But
But at 10 degrees, in some locations she might be
she might
becoming
be, yeah.
visible around here. But yeah, we're it's very interesting to me that yeah, we're kind of entering that possibility of that happening with the opposition to Pluto, but definitely while she's in Leo, she'll become visible. So it's a really interesting sort of reflection
Like
back to this
back to
past year of Venus retrograde at this year
exactly.
we get her like coming out as an evening star again in Leo. So she's
Yeah,
kind of
so
back in Leo. Yeah.
she's got a different relationship to Leo than she did before. And really mid-July has some sort of explosive energy when it comes to Mars-Venus dynamics, because we have Venus and Pluto
Mm.
meeting on the 12th of July, and then a few days later on the 15th, we have Mars making the conjunction to Uranus.
Yeah, which is similar place, not too far away from where the Jupiter Uranus took place.
Uh-huh.
And there was that new moon back there when we were talking before. So there's yeah, something interesting about that.
Yeah, and then the fact that we're basically getting to a few days later on the 21st, we're going to have that full moon at 29 degrees of
Mhm.
Capricorn, which is, as we know, is the hot spot with the Sun Pluto action before. There's many reasons why this degree is hyper focalized. And so to think about the time period between, July 5th and July 21st, and then the Venus Mars dynamics and Pluto, the sun about to oppose Pluto the day afterwards, when it moves into Leo. So it's interesting, both the Aquarius ingresses and the Leo ingresses, how they have these, now we're getting these Pluto dynamics going on. So there, it just kind of might be a little crunchy out there with just dynamics changing, things that are out of your control, things that are liberating and awakening, how that affects our dynamics with ourselves and each other, and obviously the world sphere, and how people are relating out there. So I definitely think it's going to be a little bit of a hot spot this year, that mid-July zone. Gray's like, yeah.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Yep.
Sounds good. Cruising up. So then we actually have a few days later on my mom's birthday, July 26th, Chiron is stationing retrograde. So we have another retrograde happening here. And then we're going to go into basically August, and we've got a new moon.
I guess one thing I'd say about that, just because it's being self-centered in an Aries way, but if you, like me, I got like a 22-degree Chiron on the Aries, but people like me going through a Chiron return, or maybe you just have something else at a cardinal sign. Yeah, that is just something to be aware of, like that 23.5 degree zone of the cardinal signs, like Chiron kind of pinging that. That's as far as we're going this time. Yeah, and coming back. So
coming back, yeah, that is true. It's like, that's the thing about when planets retrograde in a year, especially the outers, is that's the farthest reach it tends to get for the year. So now we've got a new moon in Leo that will be happening on August 4th. We also,
I love this one because
you like this one? Yeah.
Well, yeah, because of what I really like is the Venus. She's definitely visible at this point. She's near Regulus, and so it's a really interesting, thinking about what happened this past summer with whatever was going on with you in the Venus retrograde. This is like this new moon in Leo comes in with, and right as we come into the new moon, she'll be basically passing over the place where she went retrograde last year, but not, freshly visible as a evening star. So I like this in terms of like, there's a sextile to Jupiter, like you're showing there. Mars, Jupiter together in Gemini can actually be pretty, I think, potentially dynamic. Now they are squaring.
Right, that's my Mars return.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and it's on my Jupiter. The new moon's on my Jupiter. I'm like, okay, bookmark. So that's my selfish comment.
Yeah. I mean, the difficult part is we got the Mars Saturn, with the Jupiter Saturn square coming in.
I don't want to hear that, Gray. Don't tell me that
Mars,
part.
Mars, Saturn at the same time, and then also, I'm sure you're about to show this, but Mercury's basically going retrograde right here.
Yeah.
So this new moon, I love the Venus there, but we go right into the retrograde.
Literally the same day.
Yeah.
And then Mercury is retrograde. And this is the one that we get a hybrid retrograde, where it's going to start in Virgo, in his domicile there, and it will go back into Leo during its period of retrograde from, I think, August 4th until August 28th. So basically the majority of August, Mercury is retrograde. But there's a lot of stuff happening in August as far as just planetary action, especially with Mars and Jupiter. So, which is important to bring home, because obviously if there's action with Mars and Jupiter, who's ruling Mars and Jupiter now? Like what you were saying earlier, Gray, is like now it's whatever Mercury's doing. So we got Mercury retrograde basically taking the wheel of the dynamics that we're about to see. So we have Mars conjuncting Jupiter on the 14th, which is interesting because it's what did I have down here? We have the moon and Sag opposing it. And basically we have a T-square between the moon, Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter all on August 14th. Mars then squares Saturn on the 15th. We have the Mercury Sun inferior Cazimi a few days later on the 18th. The same day that Venus makes a T-square with Jupiter and Saturn and
Yeah, just keep it
Mars.
there for a moment, because like this is
and
the
Jupiter,
thing.
Saturn, this is big.
Yeah, and this is
And
the
the
part
full
that's
moon in squaring Uranus. I'm just throwing it all out there, Gray. Go for
yeah,
it.
and the full moon square Uranus.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to mention the part about the Mercury retrograde is that, yeah, you're right that Mercury goes retrograde, and we could think about, oh, that's too bad, because we're coming right into the Jupiter Saturn square here with Mars. But what I do like is that when right as the Jupiter Saturn square is taking effect, we have the Mercury Cazimi. So hopefully that can really help. I mean, you can see there is like a
Yeah.
problem. There is something here. There's tension. There's something to work out. We have Venus opposite Saturn. We have Mars and Jupiter together, squaring them. Mercury's ruling Venus. Mercury's ruling Mars and Jupiter. But be going through that reanimation and that reseeding of the whole cycle, and there can be clarity that's gained at this time. And so this is something that's this is a particularly powerful inferior conjunction
Yeah.
of Mercury.
Especially with
That
Uranus involved too. It's like there's a lot going on here.
and there's something. I mean, it's actually really close to the degree of Alphard, which is in the Hydra. It's like the heart of the Hydra, great dragon serpent constellation. It's close to where Venus went retrograde last time. And one thing about that constellation and Alphard, it's connecting with Venus Saturn stars, and some of the older texts, like Anonymous 379, does mention like this idea of like wisdom and being sort of like this priest of the stars in a way. Like I feel like there is something here in this like Leo way, towards the end of Leo, like to just, because this is something where Mercury inferior conjunctions, they're always just about what's going on during the retrograde, and maybe we tend to think about that operating on this smaller scale of time. But this is a Mercury inferior conjunction where there's this deeper wisdom available about larger sections of time, and that we're coming into the opening square of this new Saturn Jupiter cycle, that and we can see how the Mars and Venus cycle, they're coming into their opening square, and it's just configured right on top of each other.
Yeah.
There's a big intersection here of like personal and collective big cycles of change and things, and something to really kind of
Yeah, this is a
take
moment.
stock of. Yeah, definitely.
This is definitely a moment. Especially with the conjunction just happening in the heart of the sun, right? It's going to come, everything is going to come back to a solar moment, essentially here, which can be very powerful. The term, change your mind, change your reality comes to life in my head right now, where sometimes the biggest things that happen is just like a shift in perception, where maybe you do have that essential download, or just that understanding of self and creation, and how your life is moving forward at this dynamic period of time, and how that involves yourself and everybody that you're related to, and your relationship with the world. Like there's just, and what's awakening, it's all in the square to Uranus, why we have a full moon in this, social versus kind of personal energies of Aquarius and Leo. And then the material aspect of Uranus that's getting closer and closer to Taurus. This is the farthest it's been, 27 degrees of Taurus. Like there's there's a lot of energy here. Honestly, it would be one of my top picks for like impactful moments of 2024, is looking at essentially August 14th through August 19th. And if you're in a Mercury perfection year, get ready.
Yeah, it's definitely it's a big moment there.
It's a big
Full moon, big
moment.
full moon.
Big full moon. So, all right. Well, we said all we can say. So we'll just continue on
Yeah,
with
I think you
Mercury.
can jump ahead there. Yeah.
Yeah, Mercury's gonna go direct on August 28th.
Mm-hmm.
Venus will be getting to the end of Virgo, opposing Neptune. So she's gonna
Mm.
oppose Neptune. That's some anoretic degrees we got going on here. With some 29 degrees, which is always, hey, maybe maybe she takes a breather. Maybe she
Yeah, but right here is like where you're about to go, like when because she's about to go into Libra, and I think
Yeah,
there is a nice so there's obviously as we come into that, she's opposite Neptune, Mars is coming to square Neptune, and Mars is still squaring Neptune when she goes into Libra. But
yeah.
Mercury's gone direct, Venus goes into Libra, and I like this period here just because like we just came like we were talking about there's a real intensity we were just in. And not that that's going to go away here, but I like
Yeah.
the movement of Mercury going direct, Venus going into Libra, Mars is moving away from Jupiter, um, moving away from Saturn. It's getting a little bit of distance from them. Um, yeah, and so hopefully
So,
this can kind of come in with some nice a nice recovery or continued development with whatever you've been working on here.
well, and then this another thing that's happening during this time too is that's big. So it's maybe we're easing into what we've just experienced, right, with the Neptune action because we have Uranus going retrograde
Oh, that's
on
right. I forgot about
September
that.
1st, and then we also
Yeah.
have Pluto moving back into
That's
Capricorn on September 1st
yeah,
too.
yeah.
So
The Uranus stationing on September 1st is definitely that kind of
yeah,
wild card
yeah, you're not
element.
gonna have the best reprieve ever, but
Yeah, but
maybe
it could be
there.
exciting though. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes when there's a lot going on in life, maybe we just need to like back to the flexibility and the ability like to kind of like ease into, okay, this is what's happening, and Neptune might soften it or spiritualize it a little bit with the Venus Mars component, even though there's still very dynamic things that are happening and shifts taking place. Um,
Yeah, and the other thing is that like I would say this one compared to other years, I mean a lot of people can probably remember, oh, Uranus stationing retrograde, but recent years that's been a pretty harsh transit because Uranus has been mixed up on all kinds of things.
yeah,
And maybe I'm missing it, but I'm not really, there's not really difficult aspects with the worst thing you can come up with is Mercury's stationing direct to come into square Uranus, but I'm not honestly
yeah.
worried about that all that
Well,
much.
we'll
It's
probably get
there's
most of it in the full moon. Like that will be sort of the moment, the
yeah.
highlight of what we say. But the actual station itself um might not
Yeah,
be.
it's trining Pluto, it's sextile Neptune. It's it's at least not making there's no like well, Mercury Uranus is something for sure, but that can also be
Yeah.
real catalyzing of some growth and
Well, and
excitement too.
especially in the closing down of a lunar cycle about to
Yeah.
seed in Mercury. So we're going to have a new moon basically that
Mm-hmm.
is configured to Mercury squaring Uranus,
Mm-hmm.
where we get to chew over Uranus and what just happened. Like, so there's that. I think one of the things as we go into September's astrology, which now I'm finding that I'm segueing out of seasons and doing more months, and that might make sense. So that
Yeah, that's
we're there.
fine.
We're
Yeah,
there.
we
Uh
can pick up the
yeah.
pace moving
So
through this period.
yeah. So there's still things going, there's just things going on all the time. So basically we have that we have a new moon that is going to be opposite Saturn
Mm-hmm.
on September 2nd, right after we had these shifts of Uranus and Pluto take place. I think that it is important to note too, though, that kind of Venus and what she's right after that new moon, we have so we sort of have a Venus moment where the
Mm-hmm.
moon meets the south node, Venus is on the
Mm-hmm.
south node.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's going to cross the south node for the last time in Libra.
Mm-hmm.
I believe.
Yeah, I
Yes,
think so.
that's
I
the
think you're
case.
right about that.
We also have another dynamic aspect of Mars moving into Cancer around this time, September 4th. Which we're gonna be getting used to Mars in Cancer and Leo. It's not gonna be as dynamic or like dramatic as like when Mars went retrograde in Gemini, where it moved into Gemini and didn't leave Gemini for 7 months. We do get flavors of Cancer and Leo together. But there is something to be said about it starting to get into the territory of what will be the retrograde here. Uh, we also have a few days later, we get some sun activations of Jupiter, Saturn. So the sun will come to oppose Saturn and
Mm-hmm.
square Jupiter
Mm-hmm.
from about the 8th through the 12th of September. And
Mm-hmm.
um that will definitely illuminate some of the themes of Jupiter, Saturn on, the world stage, but also in our own lives, and back to this maybe flexibility component and how the actual, the earthly realm moves and morphs and mutates around whatever's changing with the Jupiter Saturn dynamic.
Definitely. And what's helpful about this time period, I'd say too, is that Mercury's come back into Virgo. Now Mercury's, moving fast,
Yes.
direct, no longer retrograde. So we get Mercury coming back in, which I think that'll be really helpful at this
Yeah.
time. And that's going to be good, helping out with like problem solving. But also this could be a real, I was using this again to just kind of like open up some expansion about like, what's the meaning of this opening square between Jupiter and Saturn and with your whatever you've been working on and developing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like it. I like that Mercury's back in Virgo, about to complete the shadow phase. It's done its duty.
Mhm.
Now it'll be effective and ready to go.
And we
So
start
that
getting the trine too with Venus and Jupiter that starts coming in here too. That I guess is something
mm,
else. Yeah,
yeah, I do like that. I do like that. I'm gonna fast forward to
sure.
do, 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 our lunar eclipse. So September 17th, we are going to have a lunar eclipse sandwiched between Saturn and Uranus, which Gray was, or not Uranus, Saturn and Neptune,
Saturn and Neptune, yeah.
which Gray was talking about earlier here. Um, which is kind of fascinating to think about, back to our Jupiter Mercury story, right? Because uh we've got Jupiter and Mercury sign, Mercury essentially
Mm-hmm.
strong in its element, kind of like Mercury is focalizing all the energy there itself. I mean, Venus is off doing its own thing, which we'll talk about here in a second. But what are your thoughts on this eclipse? Especially with Mercury being so strong and kind of bookending, or not bookending it, but you know, gravitizing it.
Yeah, no, it's a really big deal. And I think there's just going to be um, these much larger issues in the world that are going on related to Saturn and Neptune that'll probably really be coming out here. Um, and personally, though, I feel like this connects in with a lot of the stuff we've already been talking about,
Yeah,
honestly, for like sort of like the themes of the year. And
culminate.
um, there'll definitely be a lot of information coming in here um, related to that opening square between, Jupiter and Saturn and where you are with that and
Makes
this Neptune piece that's really emphasized especially.
Yeah, it makes me think back to what we were talking about earlier about like the dynamic of water and the waterways and
Hmm.
water issues, and
Yeah,
actually
definitely water issues.
having Mercury squaring Jupiter, and then Mercury being in this highly practical position of problem solving. It makes me wonder if there will be certain things that might come out at this time whether it's technology or just new ideas, or even bring things more into awareness of how can we help, how can we be of service to, how can we just use our mental faculties and the resources to show some compassion, whether it's for aquatic creatures, for the water itself, or getting people the water that they need, or dealing with these larger issues. Or just be the beginning of that. Sometimes it could be just like when a group or a foundation comes together and you're forming something that's going to take care of something later, continuing on these themes of what we do today impacts tomorrow dynamic.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with Saturn Neptune and how there can be disillusionment with that. Talked about this last year, but it definitely goes really well with the Solutio phase of alchemy, the way that's talked about in a more psychological, when people apply like alchemy to psychology, and just that solutio of things being dissolved, but ultimately a solution can emerge out of that as things start, just looking at, I mean, if there might be just things about the dream you have for the world, or what you really want to be doing, that needs to be looked at, reshaped. I think there's just information coming in about that, what's working, what's not working. You want to keep doing more of this and you're really excited about it, or you kind of realize, I want to do less of this and more of that. And hopefully there can be some good, though, also imaginal, creative things coming out of this, instead of it just being, like negative eclipse Saturn Neptune stuff.
Yeah.
Because Saturn Neptune can be extremely creative, and especially in Pisces. And so hopefully there can also be some there's always like negative eclipse stories, positive eclipse stories. So
well, which reminds me,
coming in.
to me, this speaks of sort of like being in that duality of life again too, where there's this, but there's also that, and but I had forgot that I had some Jupiter Saturn things to share. But I'm going to share some of the light-sided ones to bring in the imaginal thing of what you're talking about, because essentially we are seeing this is a lead up of of an eclipse that does tap into Saturn Jupiter before it eclipses, right?
And the fact that the nodes haven't gone into, this is like,
yeah.
I guess we haven't spoken to the fact this is starting the Pisces Virgo eclipse story.
This is a hint.
Yeah, it's kind of set. Yeah, so it is really, it's setting something in motion here that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people will, look back to your life in November of 2021, when we had that first eclipse in Taurus, before we had the, and everybody is like, oh, this dynamic thing happened, and then it all, all played out within the actual, when the nodes got in there, and then the time to come. But there is usually something dynamic that can happen within this access first, that is the foreshadowing or kicks things off. But just some, fun facts of Jupiter, Saturn, Gemini and Pisces in the square is actually Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, during that square, he was booed by the crowds at the Newport Folk Festival, because it was the first time he performed with an electric guitar and basically created folk rock. And so here we see this pushing forward of the, creative space and new ideas. And I think he's a Gemini. And he's a Gemini. I'm pretty sure he's a Gemini.
Yeah, he's a Gemini. And that's a good example too, just that early 60s of not just Dylan sort of revolutionizing folk in that way, but just music in general. There's so much creative.
Yeah. Well, he's pushing the boundaries, right? And that's what we're doing. We have new ideas, new the experimentations that push the boundary.
Mhm.
It's actually the time when he also released like a Rolling Stone came
Mm.
out during the Jupiter Saturn square. Also
Wow.
same on the Jupiter Saturn square, like the day after it, Otis Redding recorded Respect with the song Respect, which I mean, obviously we know by Aretha Franklin and her rendition of it. But it's just such a it's just, it will be interesting to see like creatively what comes out during this time period because of it's just the quality, the parrot quality of Gemini and what could be
Well,
created to which we would be able to sing and chant and like, you know, for time afterwards. So
like
thought those were little fun facts.
a Rolling Stone feels apropos of
Very
this or
fitting,
whatever.
doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
Very fitting. So, all right. Let's go back to our notes here. Let me go. Do, 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 do. Gosh, where are we, Ray? Okay, we're in mid-September.
Yeah, I mean, we could go.
We're
I mean,
mid.
and the sun will oppose Neptune, but we're basically going into the next quarter of the year. I mean, I don't know if
Yes.
there's anything
And
else
we're in
to
eclipse
talk about.
season. Like that's
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
happening
Yeah. It
here.
starts up. Yeah.
We're
So we get this weird, like you mentioned, the thing to remember, more recent memory would be, what, November of 2021, where we get, the first of a Taurus lunar eclipse happening, but there was still,
the nodes and the
I guess, was that a solar
no, it was a lunar.
eclipse in, oh no, I'm thinking in, was in Sagittarius that came in around that time too. So there, I'm just
Oh
saying
yeah,
there's
after it.
still like the mixture of
Yeah, the
two
mixture of
signs. So
signs.
we get the first. So we've already got a Aries Libra eclipse story happening for you,
Yeah.
and we're heading towards we're heading towards a Libra solar eclipse, which you'll probably show in a moment. But
Yes.
before we get there, we get the new Pisces Virgo eclipse narrative
Yeah.
starts up with a Pisces lunar eclipse, and then we're in between eclipses going to the Libra
Yes.
eclipse. Yeah.
Yes. So we're about to exit Virgo season and move into the Libra equinox here, which I am just going to pull up that real quick just because I want to um emphasize how that time of the year and that ingress, because even though, you know, in the United States we have a fixed Aries ingress with the Scorpio rising, you know, other places in the world might not have that. And so there's always the dynamic to the ingress charts of the seasons. And I think it's very um interesting is not the word, but I'm gonna use it anyways. I think it's very interesting that the Libra season starts with Venus squaring Pluto at the
Yeah.
final 29 degrees. And that's the thing here too, is like Venus is squaring Pluto in this ingress. The sun is going to square Pluto, and these are the final movements and activations of this 29-degree Capricorn placement and this line, this invisible line, as Gray was talking about earlier. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on this or wanted to
Yeah. Well,
share or
just
just
that
observe.
it would have already been going on before this, but again, just, about 3 weeks before this, when Pluto goes back into Capricorn, we're returning back to something about these older Capricorn issues, and there'll probably be stuff coming out with that. I guess with Venus squaring it, I don't
There's like
know. I mean,
it's like justice issues. It's like trying
yeah.
like the difficulty of coming together and compromising in power
Hmm.
relations, which we're gonna see because this to me is interesting foreshadowing for actually Mars going retrograde. Um, where it's almost like Venus and Pluto can't, it's difficult to work something out, and then Mars comes into the scene. Uh, just as far as like when I think about relations or maybe foreign relations and things along those lines.
Yeah, and just
Um,
think about if you're reading this more like a horary chart, which it isn't necessarily, but just the Venus is in Libra, but so she's about to go into Scorpio. It sort of
yeah.
does show that there's like, but then squaring Pluto, it's almost like there's something about you got to go down into this
And honestly, we just
plutonics.
witnessed
Yeah.
this. We just went through this in the actual sky, and I watched it around. I watched it in my
Mm.
relationship. I watched it in relationships around me. I watched relationships break under this Venus squaring Pluto and then going into the detriment of Scorpio and you know, the descent that then is Venus in a Mars ruled sign. So it is a difficult aspect. And we're probably going to see it. And it's elongated because it is an ingress
One
for a
thing it does
quarter.
make me think of, because you have the United States chart up here, I guess I will just say is that, you know, this is an election year and it's a pretty
Yes.
pivotal
Yes.
election. And I think a thing that people have a hard time about is that, you know, that there's who you can even vote for. There's not going to be like anyone even probably it's like the choice isn't really like what's going to make you excited probably, but about anything, any particular direction. But it's like there are like really big issues, and we were talking about justice, and like there are some things that are like there can, it just makes me think of just like this plutonic intensity of like what you think is fair and just, and just the intensity of that as we head into this election.
Yeah, it's let me go ahead and select my speaker. We've got to the point in the broadcast, Gray, where we've been talking so long that I lost my I lost my air.
Yeah. And I guess to be specific about that, one of the things that definitely make me think about is abortion rates, and how we've seen, even if it doesn't seem like it matters who's the president, it can in terms of who they're appointed to the Supreme Court, and you know how that led into what happened with the Supreme Court decision related to abortion. So yeah, that's just the kind of thing I'm thinking of with that.
Let me go. All right. I'm just messing with my does my sound okay? I know we're
It
in the
does right now. Yeah.
okay.
For me, it does. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. I think, yeah, sorry. Just had to redo some technology, had to have a Mercury retrograde moment right there. Um so there we go. Now I'm back on the screen. All right. Yeah, I think that well, that's going to be a hot button issue as people you know, debate on the stage of yeah, so I think you're right. You're right on there. So what if I tell you the universe loves to set it up, sets the stage every time. So let us move on. We've got and so keep that in mind as we talk about all the astrology here. We are smack dab in the middle of the lead up to the election in the United States. So we have as the sun gets situated in.
Which, just to speak, I mean, I'm realizing we've completely avoided this topic so far, but there's so many things that go with how wild the astrology is, where, you know,
Yeah.
one of the potential candidates who could end up winning is also like in court, and you know, it's like people are trying to be like, it's just so crazy. I mean, but that's all going to feed into this, and we'll know more about what happens related to all these different court cases by then. And but yeah, that's just like a whole another thing. I don't want to. We
It's
don't need to take up time talking
yeah,
about, but it's just
wild.
it's all going to be part of this. So yeah.
So not too long after.
Actually, they're both involved in court, because I mean, they're now, I think, gonna try to impeach Biden, I think, over his son Hunter Biden. So like it's just a big mess, you know. Yeah, so
Hello, 29-degree Pluto.
yeah.
It's all a big mess. It's all a mess. So speaking of mess, we actually have another Sun Mercury conjunction that's going to happen on the South Node at the end of September there, in which will lead us into the eclipse, the
Yeah, should go right to
eclipse.
that eclipse.
So October 2nd, we have an eclipse in Libra at 10 degrees, another South Node eclipse. And is this our final eclipse or is there one more in this axis?
I don't think it's the final one, no.
Final, so we have one more Libra one, don't we? I
I
think.
think we have one of each actually, but I could be wrong. because we
Oh,
don't
we have
have
one
a
more Aries.
yeah, just like barely, right? Yeah, March 29th, and then there's one in
Oh yeah,
Libra.
yeah.
Oh no, it's a
Oh,
Virgo lunar eclipse, I think. So it might be the last
it's the last Libra.
Libra. It might be the last Libra.
Yeah.
Because there doesn't end up, I think if I'm remembering right, there's not a Pisces solar
Yes.
eclipse.
And that, yeah. I'm bummed by that. Honestly, Greg. I am
I'm not worrying
bummed.
about that one
Well, I
myself.
know you're not, but I mean, that's my fifth house. I'm like, come on, give me open the door. Open the door. Um, no,
Well, the one theme is that there's like we just saw that lunar eclipse in Pisces, what's interesting, but that there are some really powerful lunar eclipses coming in on that Pisces Virgo axis that hit the
yeah,
Saturn Neptune. So that's going to be a definite
it's gonna
theme
be
is like these
something.
really powerful lunar eclipses. Yeah. But anyway, this is like the last Libra solar eclipse.
Last Libra solar, which we have configured to the south node, and we have Mercury right there. We also
I
have
mean,
Black
it's
Lilith if you
squaring Mars, so that's the thing. I mean, this is like there's some. I can't say this looks like a wonderful eclipse,
it
but
sounds like a wild election, is what that sounds like to me.
yeah, and speaking of that in the election, what we can see, they're still far apart. They're still, not necessarily Mars's orb, but Mars by whole sign, you can see that opposition to Pluto. It's like getting within 14 degrees. And I feel like this is when we really get fully, like more fully initiate into this Mars Pluto opposition because we get this
Yeah.
Libra solar eclipse with Mercury squaring Mars. And even though we're not quite yet to that Mars Pluto opposition, like there's something about it getting kind of set off here.
Yeah.
And this is big power dynamics in personal life, but also in the world. Like there's big things that seem to be about this Mars Pluto opposition that'll go down.
Yeah.
Not the United States election being one element, the United States being sort of like one of the empires of the world and who's in charge of that empire. But I mean, it's all over the place. We'll be seeing big power dynamic things happening. Yeah.
Oh yeah, they're the powers that be will be out to grab and working behind the scenes, and there's going to be a whole theme to the fall. It's going to be a theme into the next year. It's yeah, it's definitely a theme. I find it also interesting that we have this
Mhm.
grand water triangle
Yeah, that
on
is interesting.
that Venus is basically applying to, and she's the
Mhm.
ruler of this eclipse in her detriment, but she's so we got a Venus in detriment and then we got a Mars in fall basically. Basically, so they're trying to help each other out, but oh, they've got their own things going on. They got their own eccentricities and potential difficulties to work through. But there is sort of this sense of form or flow or order or a lot of emotional content or connective content that's going on with this eclipse. I have mixed feelings about it. I see its difficulties, but I also see I don't know.
I mean, the water triangle is something.
It is something. It's definitely something. I didn't, what image came in my mind is a toilet bowl flushing. Like the water going down, circling and going down. For whatever reason, but that's what came in. All right. I wish I had a little bit more say about that. I think when we get so far into our marathon programs, my brain starts to go blip, 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 blip. My brain's like the AirPod when it's dying and it makes
Yeah. Well, I
noise.
brought up some other stars. I mean, one thing that's in rare Venus is there, which does make that little place of Scorpio actually quite powerful. I'm pretty sure for one, she's in her own bounds. She's definitely in her own triplicity. And
Yes.
then that is also, she's in her own bounds, right? Oh yeah, you can
I
see
think
it
so.
there.
Yeah,
Yep,
well,
in her own bound. I think
kind
so.
of.
Pretty
Hold on.
sure.
I'll let you know.
I'm pretty sure she's in
Check.
her own bounds. And then triplicity, and then yeah.
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 No, she's in triplicity, but she has squeaked into Mercury's bounds.
Oh, really? At
Oh
11?
yeah, she
Okay, maybe
that's
it's
what
right.
I don't know if you can see it. I'm like pointing, but you can't see my pointer. Yeah, it's just
Mm.
like barely in there.
Okay, so maybe that's just it ends right there. Okay.
So the lead
Well,
up, she's in her.
yeah, well, I was gonna say there's a fixed star, Alphecca in the Corona Borealis, star of Ariadne, Ariadne's crown, where it's a star that has it's a star of the nature of Venus, and is very much about can be about like sort of crowns and honors, and but also like the what comes in when you take on that crown, the responsibility of that, sort of things that we've already been talking about, where maybe if you are having some advancement, you're going to have to really come to terms with the
Yeah,
responsibilities
I was thinking about that earlier today.
of involved in that. Yeah.
Heavy is the head that wears the crown.
Hmm.
The well, and so let's move forward in within this lunar cycle itself, because there's a lot of dynamic aspects that are taking place with the sun and Mars, and actually Chiron, because the sun and Mars are getting to their place where they're forming their square. And we're going to have a full moon. Actually, I'm just going to go straight to that full moon real quick.
Yeah, that full moon is big.
Full moon on October 17th, that is in Aries.
Yeah.
That is basically lighting up a T-square with Sun, Mars, Chiron. Keep in mind, we're in Mars that is now in full shadow phase of the upcoming retrograde. We're in definitely Mars territory, because something to consider with mid-October through November is that we're going to also, right after this, have a new moon in Scorpio that's going to be ruled by Mars opposing Pluto. So we're entering a really Martian combative, potentially volatile, especially thinking about just election season and how everybody's like, this, that, it's like, like just all that business. Yeah. So, I mean, what pops out to you?
Yeah, just what you were saying. So it's the fact that this whole lunar cycle begins with a powerful solar eclipse in Libra that's squaring Mars, and then we hit the full moon where it's completely activating it. So the lunar cycle, we have this impending Mars Pluto opposition, which is going to play out for an extended period of time because of Mars going retrograde, and both the solar eclipse and the following full moon just like kind of like light it on fire. I mean, and this is the one that's really lighting it on fire, being an Aries full moon. And so
And I mean, Mars
it's one of the things where it's just like gotta get ready. I mean, just be ready for real dynamic change coming in here.
well, and then just thinking about Mars and Cancer, it's like how Mars, how Mars fights, how Mars goes about things in Cancer. It's very sideways and emotional, and like hits you in in the things you care about, and the pulling on your your emotional and protective self. And I think about, just to bring up, obviously we're going to be referring to election season, just the fight being around domestic issues, or around things that people want to protect, that are close to them or their family, or their idea of allegiance to a nation, right? Cancer is very connected to patriotism too. So yeah, it definitely feels heightened and
There
jarring.
is a mutual reception between Mars and the moon, which,
It's true.
technically we could say we perhaps be mitigating a bit of that. But so maybe at least in our personal lives, this could be playing out in a more really productively dynamic way.
True. But
Probably just going to be a
it
big
will have
mess
that
in
tension though.
world.
I mean,
Yeah, it's still going to have the tension. Yeah.
so expect a lot of tension, personally, collectively. Um, yeah. So let's move on. I already feel the tension. So we're gonna move
The
on
new moon.
let's move on to the new moon. Yeah, here we go. Fast forwarding to November 1st. I mean, when I saw this configuration, Gray, I was like, oh, good Lord. Good Lord. A new moon in
So
Scorpio.
it's basically two,
It-
yeah, just two lunations in a row, you know, ruled by
but the
Mars
fact
opposing
that
Pluto, basically.
it's like the day.
Mm-hmm.
It's the day of that
Mm-hmm.
first. And this is actually what I kind of wanted to share with some of the research that I did on
Mm.
Mars, Pluto. And not to say that this is the same time period by any means, because every time we get an aspect, no matter if we've had an aspect or reverse or it, or like, there's always different combinations going on in the sky. But immediately I was kind of intrigued. I was like, well, let me look back to when Mars was in the reverse placement of this, when back in the late 30s, we had Mars at 29 degrees of Capricorn opposing Pluto at 29 degrees of Cancer. So basically the reversed position.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it fascinating that whole Mars retrograde cycle, because it's not every day that Mars opposes Pluto, but also does a retrograde cycle over it. So you got to keep that in mind. Um, so this was actually a really crucial time to the buildup of World War II. Not to say that we're going into World War III or anything like that. And it's also important to think about just Mars at that time in Capricorn was in its exalted state versus Mars in its fallen state here too. It's a different effect. Um, but right before the first Mars Pluto opposition on those anaretic degrees in May of 1939, there was a Germany and Italy signed the Pact of Steel, which basically made alliances between Germany and Italy as
Mm-hmm.
the, advancing Hitler's um, agenda and obviously fascist Germany. And so it tied them both together in this pact that really started to solidify the Axis powers. And it was later in that summer on August 23rd, actually the same day that Mars turned direct, the very same day, that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, which was a non-aggressive treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So then it formed this alliance between the two that was basically, it shocked the whole international community because it paved the way for the invasion into Poland in September, when that was the next opposition to Pluto. And so there's something to be said about Mars and any planet that's retrograde, but especially when we're thinking about Mars, um, working behind the scenes and what happens when it's in retrograde motion, that can come out and be rather explosive on the other end of it. And we talked about this in the Gemini version when Shu and Spencer Michaud joined me, because there was these themes of that too. So there's always this behind the scenes aggression or plotting that happens with Mars retrograde. So I just wanted to share that because I couldn't believe that how perfectly those lined up with such pivotal um timing for these. I mean, we're talking about Mars is the god of war. Pluto is this is the power, is the underworld power. So yeah, I wanted to share that.
And so again, that was Mars went retrograde from Aquarius back to Capricorn. That
Yes.
basically was opposite Pluto and Leo. So it's the opposite. And then one other thing I would say about that, yeah, because also it's really not sounding good in terms of that led
Yeah.
into the power dynamics that then led into the eruption of World War II, is though that at that time Saturn was in Taurus. So we actually had Saturn squaring Pluto. So it was actually a Mars, Saturn, Pluto. It's like it was actually worse astrology than what we have here. It was not only was it Mars Pluto retrograde time, it was Saturn Pluto time. So that piece thankfully we don't have going on, at least this time.
Yeah. So
That's
it's
a
not
key
the same.
difference. But it's still it does, though, you're right that it relates to things that potentially could happen. I mean, people are talking about the dangers of a world war. I know
Well,
I've been
about
less, I'm not been so sure, but like, I don't really know still if I really feel like it's going to be like a World War II scenario, but certainly what we're already seeing with like Israel, what we're seeing with like Ukraine, Russia, where like there's wars happening and then other powers are really actually involved in the supporting and giving money and that
exactly.
kind of thing. Certainly we already know it's already going on,
But I think
and
the opposite.
there'll be some other things going on like that, I think. Yeah. What are you gonna?
Well, and I think that's the interesting part about the reverse of the configuration is the opposite,
Mm-hmm.
because now we got Mars in Cancer. It's this different, like we're getting to this place, especially with Jupiter in Pisces, like the humanitarian side of things, the care, like the fact that, the 29-degree Pluto is so in your face now with these power dynamics that I don't necessarily think it would happen again like that by any means. If anything, it can be, and hopefully like a repeat of history where it starts that, but the ability for it to carry out would be different because of just the awareness of people and how we've hopefully evolved um, over time and caring a little bit more. But that could be my idealistic Pisces South Node speaking. I don't know. But
Yeah, I mean, it could be, and I definitely, it's a really key difference again is that it's not, we don't have Saturn in a T square with them, so
yeah,
that's something we can be thankful for,
thank
which was what
goodness.
was happening then. I mean, one thing I did see that goes with Mars retrograde in Leo, not necessarily like Leo to Cancer, but a different sort of dynamic than we were talking about, but it is like world alliances and power deals and there's things like like the United Nations, for example, where there's a lot of people concerned about things related to the United Nations, and where do they have too much control, or people like coming together too much to
Mm,
dictate what things are happening. That's obviously how I'm not saying it's obviously it's what led to the creation of the state of Israel back
yeah,
in
back
the
after
day after the
war.
World War II. But there's also always like that potential. What could the United Nations do in a positive sense? And then people are sometimes all upset about that, and it's like it's not doing enough. And why can't it bring about a ceasefire in Israel, for example? But when we're talking about these global entities, there is something I noticed that was kind of strange that I think probably goes with this. So there was in 45 to 46, there was a Leo to Cancer one like we have now. That the United Nations formed in October, like right before it. So sort of in the eclipse season, and there had already been a World Bank thing forming, but there was more 21 nations, I guess, ratified the articles creating the World Bank during that retrograde. A later one in 48, which was basically Virgo to Leo. The World Health Organization was created by the United Nations. There was also a general agreement on tariffs and trade that was inaugurated that was it one of those things that's about promoting international trade and removing tariffs. And but it's again one of those big global agreements around trade and money and power dynamics, which we can imagine stuff like that happening again. And that actually pretty much stayed in effect apparently, from what I read, until 95 when Mars was again retrograde from Virgo to Leo. And that was when the World Trade Organization was established. So I was finding some previous Mars, these kind of global agreements
Mhm. It was just
and
such an
things coming in
yeah,
where like, yeah, we can maybe
alliances.
yeah, there's some major thing going on during this time period about all of these things. And
Yeah.
yeah.
And then this is essentially the new moon period that the election is under. So it'll be intriguing to see the dynamic of how it all plays out. And I guess we'll just have to wait and see, but it is definitely a volatile signature and one that sets up a longer stage because it's not just a one pass, it's a whole story between Mars and Pluto and Mars getting ready to retrograde. So, let us move on, Gray. Want to get this recording in under 4 hours.
Yeah.
No one needs to listen to us over 4 hours. This is
There's
so
there's that full moon. Did you do the full? You should do the full moon, I think.
yeah. So
Well, Mars goes into Leo right after that,
yeah.
obviously.
So Mars is
But
in Leo
yeah,
on November 4th.
but the
And
full
then
moon, I think,
we're
is a
gonna,
big thing.
we're gonna fast forward to our full moon on November 15th. Full moon in Taurus, which is going to be conjunct a retrograde Uranus. So we get our Uranus
Yeah.
action here.
Yep, that's gonna be in America. People were really excited about that election results, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, because is the election on the 12th?
It would have already happened. Yeah.
So here we got a Venus ruled full moon with Venus at the bending of the nodes in Capricorn. So that definitely speaks to some of the power dynamics going on and the justice of the right bureaucratic choices. Yeah, another full moon, another activation of Uranus, basically, which is always exciting, which is always somewhat unpredictable or unstable. Any thoughts on this full moon besides the fact that it's Uranian and has a nodal twist?
Yeah. I mean, again, this makes me think that there's something going back here to that Jupiter, Uranus, and whatever is kind of going on with that with you related to the beginning of the year. But now we're in a totally different, place with things. It's hard to separate this living in the United States from the election and what's going to happen with that. But certainly other parts of the world will have their own things going on at this time.
Which I don't think, Gray, we even stated, just for the record, back in mid-October, Jupiter went retrograde right after the solar eclipse.
Yeah.
Pluto stationed direct right before that full moon in Aries. So just to add a little extra emphasis to the planetary movements.
Well, this is the right before, and what this is really picking up is it's this full moon trining Pluto too. So it's Uranian, but it's also trining Pluto right before Pluto goes back into Aquarius for good. And in a few days, when Pluto goes back into Aquarius for good, it is in Aquarius until 2043.
Forever.
This is the end of the Pluto and Capricorn with finality. So what I guess it makes me think about is, again, ready for that you always say at a full moon conjunct Uranus, you expect the unexpected. but hopefully, even though there could be really difficult world events happening,
I know
figuring out how to whatever finding that I guess the using it to kind of feel what you really want to be doing, kind of like it kind of makes me think almost like not irregardless of what's going on in the world, but like it'll probably be very deeply concerned with what's going on in the world. But if you don't like what's going on in the world, sort of using that to motivate yourself to create your own kind of change and what you're able to do in your life is what it makes me think about.
Well, we forgot one key component of this full moon, and that's Saturn stations direct on it. So that's happening.
Yeah, that's massive. It's the same day,
massive.
right?
Yeah, it's the same day.
Yeah, so that's huge. I mean, and we've seen this already with Saturn, Saturn stationing in Pisces, and we've already been seeing a lot and often big events related to water. What's also happening is Saturn stationing direct and Jupiter's already retrograde. So we're about a month away. It's around, what is it, December 24th, that we get the next Saturn Jupiter square. So we're also heading into a period now where with Saturn going direct here, we're going to come into the second of their 3 square aspects. Yeah. So that's also intensifying here.
Yes.
In addition, Pluto going into Aquarius. It's pretty big Saturn Pluto stuff, like Saturn stations and then Pluto goes into Aquarius, like bam, bam, just within days with that
Yeah.
full moon, just kind of electrifying it.
Yeah, so this is going to be a very intense period of time just in the world, in your personal life. And so just to know, knowledge is power. Just be aware of what's going on, and make the best use of it. Because not too long after that, now we got Pluto and Aquarius for forever. What it can seem like forever. And then we have Mercury, who's going to go station retrograde. Actually, on the point that it's stationed direct, will be
Hmm.
stationed direct here on January 1st. So 22 degrees of Sagittarius. So we are uh, basically, getting into the final months out of the year, but we don't leave 2024 with an easy, like a month. There's actually a lot going on as we head into December. Before we get there, we have a new moon in Sagittarius, which will be squaring that Saturn that's now direct. So once again, we have another lunation that is, and really it's in opposition to Jupiter too. So
Mm-hmm.
we have this whole kind of opening of solar and lunar energy and this whole cycle that is going to emphasize the Jupiter Saturn momentum, um, which can be it will be very externalized in the sense that, I mean, it's Sagittarius and Gemini. It's usually those signs are out there, but Jupiter is retrograde. So there is the internal component of the dynamic energy of what's changing and shifting and the story chapters and uh yeah, just how we're growing, how we're what we're envisioning, how we're acting on that, but it's still almost being, in my mind, like an incubation process still,
Mm-hmm.
especially with
Yeah, and that's I love all that for the new moon. And then the other thing is, it's a few days after this, so we're in the retrograde. So this is a we already talked about these Mercury retrogrades in fire signs as maybe being about helping to see what's getting in the way or having to reek of what's bringing more vitality and excitement and inspiration. And this is one that's really very much about, it's very configured to that Jupiter Saturn square.
yeah, let's actually move forward
Yeah, because you
to
go,
that.
because right, yeah, because after the new moon, then we come into a Kazemi, and it's pretty tightly configured to it.
Yeah.
And this is like within a month, within couple weeks from now, we'll actually have the Jupiter Saturn square happening. But before we get to it, we get this Mercury Kazemi giving us some real information about whatever that is.
Well,
And so you can definitely think about in the United States, for example, whatever happened a month earlier with that option, and how you can start seeing what's going to societally, how are you going to like adjust to that, for example, but it could be about a bunch of things. But definitely kind of tapping you into larger societal changes and how your personal life and growth and development, what you're working on, kind of intersects with that. It's something that makes me think of, because then also we got Venus, Pluto coming in at the same time.
yeah, Venus,
At the
Pluto.
same time, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
and it's to harken back to another big hot spot of the year that we were talking about earlier with August, late August, and the fact that we had
Oh,
the Kazemi then, and that was activating, or it was just coinciding with Jupiter and Saturn. I mean, it was configured to Uranus, but the fact that we get these, back to back inferior Kazemis that happen during these Jupiter Saturn, you know, hotspots, and now it actually is configured to it. Seems very
well, not just that, but I just realized because you stopped it too early, but Mars goes retrograde on this day, actually.
well, Mars goes
So
retrograde. Yeah.
isn't it December 6th? I have it as December 6th. Am I wrong? Or is it?
Oh, you're right. You're right. It's interesting because the supposedly actually Mercury Sun is on the 5th, technically. Um,
Okay.
and then it's so okay. Let's do a lead up because I think it's context, because this period of time is very loaded. And I think we already
Yeah, it's
have.
really loaded.
It's
Yeah.
really loaded. So basically, the 5th, we got Sun Mercury. The 6th, we got Mars stationing retrograde in Leo.
Mm-hmm.
The 7th, we've got Venus and Pluto coming together. We also got the Sun opposing Jupiter at this time. And we also have Neptune stationing direct on the 7th. And then a couple days later, on the 11th, Venus opposes Mars. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, from the 5th through the 11th, basically through the new moon in Sag to the full moon in Gemini, which will be square Neptune, who's just stationing, there is a lot going on. So this is hotspot alert. Hotspot alert. What do you want to talk about with it? What's your
Yeah, I mean, what also happens, and even just add in the next thing while we're talking about this now, is like about, what was it, like a week later when Mercury stations direct, it's kind of trining
trining Mars?
Mars. So there, but the key thing is when we're passing Mars is when we're in the center of the Mercury retrograde, and we're talking about that and trying to gain that clarity related to the Jupiter Saturn dynamics going on. Mars is stationing at the same time. So it tends to be this real and then the Venus Pluto coming in. So there's definitely a huge thing here about power dynamics being exposed, and but hopefully with the Mercury, I guess the thing I would hope is the Mercury Sun helps gain some deeper realizations about this as Mercury stations direct, trining Mars and moves forward again. I mean, that's the only thing, that's something about this where perhaps in the end, Mercury can help with some understanding a bit about how to work with whatever starts developing here. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of just a lot of tension going on, even if we're trying to like wrap our heads around it. You know, uh, Mercury being in Mercury just being in Jupiter sign too. So here we have this like mutual reception going
Yeah,
on
we didn't bring
between.
that up earlier, but there's a mutual
Yeah.
reception in that opposition, right?
Yeah. So trying
Which,
to
I mean, I
grasp
think
like
that
the big picture and the like
yeah,
yeah.
but I feel like that does help. To me, that helps with grasping the bigger picture. But yeah, I mean,
What we've
there's
got in the moment and like kind of
mm,
being going back to that term, which might be actually one of my takeaway words is that flexibility, you
mhm.
know, within this time period and how things are shifting. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I often thought that Mercury and Jupiter, being all about the mutable sign, it's all about that sort of flexibility of consciousness and how
Mhm.
important that is.
Yeah. So grab a hold of that. Grab a hold of that duality in December during the holiday season. We got the holidays rearing up, and this is basically going down. And then
Yeah.
what I know. So festive holiday season, which actually brings us to Christmas Eve when we have Jupiter who's retrograde squaring Saturn. So that's the
Yeah.
actual next it's a little early right there. So basically Christmas.
Yeah, and then you can see Mercury's not coming direct and comes back into
Yeah, opposition or is it
the
into
yeah.
the T square.
Yeah, back into the T square with Saturn and Jupiter, but now it's moving direct. And this is also then as Pluto and Mars are getting within about a couple 3 degrees of
Yes.
opposing one another. So that opposition's really intensifying as we come to the end of the year. And
And
so
in
that
different
yeah.
signs too. So it's like a different flavor than the first one we felt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it is at 0 degrees of Leo and Aquarius instead,
Mm-hmm.
which, and then we got Venus squaring Uranus at this time too. So there's a lot going on at the end of the year, but I'm just going to fast forward. And I think we could probably close out on looking at the
Yeah.
moon.
The new moon, yeah.
Yeah, so we got a new moon on December 30th in Capricorn, 9 degrees, which is actually it's in a well, what did I write here? Well, it is the new moon that encapsulates Jupiter and Saturn square there. and especially it being a Saturn ruled moon. So there is that dynamic. Um, can't get away from Mars retrograde opposing Pluto. Like that's that's that.
And Mars is the exaltation ruler of the new moon, so
Mm.
there's a way that that comes in still a bit. But yeah, it's at least nice that hopefully it's helpful that the new moon is in a domicile of Saturn and basically a sextiling Saturn. So maybe
Yeah, I
that
think
can be some helpful support for this time.
it will be definitely be a dynamic end to the year. And it's much like the overlay of Mars retrograde in Gemini that had the same kind of effect where we had Mars retrograde during the holidays and into the beginning part of the next year. There might be a lot that is like dynamically shifting and some intensity going on, maybe in the world, but also within the self and the dynamics that are changing, but we're not quite there yet. So it's not going to have that same flow like we have at the beginning of this year, where all of a sudden we get this dynamic Capricorn action. We got some Earth trines. We can really work with the energy. Here, there's more of a I'm going to use the word incubation period again, too. It's like an intense one. There's a lot going on. There'll be a lot going on behind the scenes, but it doesn't have quite that like new year, new me. There's a lot of complications. I feel like of like how the story is progressing and things that need to be worked out. Um,
Yeah. In fact, I'm thinking of let's see. I'm gonna quote myself because
quote myself.
I wrote something for I wrote for these are the plug. If anyone wants a beautiful journal for the year ahead, Ignota Press out of London, United Kingdom, published. They have their journal that I did the forecast for. So I'm just gonna read what I wrote because I was just thinking it's like a why
Why not? Get in there.
yeah, I wrote 2024 will end with a cliffhanger. Because of what you're saying, Jupiter retrograde squaring Saturn. At the same time, Mars is, retrograding back to oppose Pluto. And so the year will not end with clarity and definitive conclusions, but rather questions and activations that can stimulate soul searching and hopefully productive growth in the year ahead. So that's kind of, I just feel like there's something about this. It does have a bit of a cliffhanger thing to me
Love
because
that.
the New Year is like ending and it's like, but it's not, it's all the stuff's still about to happen. We're kind of in the calendar year is flipping kind of before the astrology is playing out. But whatever is going on here, there is something about Mars opposing Pluto activating that beginning of Aquarius, which we keep talking about as being part of this whole new epochal era with the Jupiter Saturn squaring at that critical phase relating to what was begun in 2020. And this is sort of taking us in like the heart of whatever journey we're on. Because I do think of Mars as being very much about being on a journey quest, and there's a lot more that's going to happen in this Mars retrograde that we're not going to talk about because it's all about 2025. But
Yeah, you're gonna have to wait until next
where
year.
it goes on, yeah. But yeah, it's a very different end to the year than this year, where
Yeah,
there
I
could
love
definitely
the
be stuff
cliffhanger.
you're kind of like you might want to have, it'll be on situations. Some of us will probably have a bunch of stuff we're having to respond to and take care of because there's just a bunch of stuff happening with some of these aspects that are going on at the end of next year.
Yeah. So if that's not a Capricorn way to end, I just imagine I just see a goat hanging off the edge of the cliff, like on the, like prepping itself on the side of the, oh my goodness. Oh, Gray. My eyes are just like, that's what
Yeah,
we call power forecasting. That is
yeah.
power forecasting. So, we can't get away until we think of one word. What do you got? What do you got? One word to describe
I'm gonna
2024.
say magician because I don't think I said this at the beginning. but I think I told you off camera when I pulled a card earlier for like what's like a major arcana for the year. I pulled the Magician, but then in my own personal life, I keep pulling the Magician. I have this Leonora Carrington, the surrealist painter, the deck of cards that people have created now that's based on her power paintings of the major arcana. So it's Carnum. You can only pull a major arcana. It's only all major arcana. But ever since the Libra solar eclipse, I keep pulling the Magician, and I just did it again. So, by saying the Magician, I think there's just a lot of which I know I think we brought up the Magician last year, but I feel like it's more important this next year, which is what you're able to do with your life, what you're able to take responsibility and accountability for. It's just really important, and it's really important to do what you're able to do to get into your passion, what you really want to create with your life, in ways that can help inspire other people and support other people to do the same as we head into like a lot of, societal instability in the
Yeah.
years ahead and disruptions. And
Well, I think I'm just going to use the card that I got too, because it's fitting and it's like literally the other end of the spectrum, which was I had drawn Judgment before we got on here. And so I even think about like your story, Gray, and like how you're making the shift and you're being the magician in your life and going into this next stage. But there's also this element of judgment where you can't go back. Like there's like you can't go back to the past. There's like this element of answering the call of your life.
yeah,
Your
definitely.
life is calling. Are you going to answer?
Mhm.
Essentially. So
And I
there.
think we've sort of been seeing that on all these forecasts ever since we were coming into 2020. But on that first one we were describing, it was hard to know because we didn't know what's going to happen. But that really was a turning point of like, things were not going back, and we've kind of known that. But now we're really in the thick of it, and
Well, and it's a different not going back too. I mean, we're not going back from how it was 2 years ago, like post
mhm,
pandemic. That's very
mhm.
Jupiter Saturn. It's the turning of it's the crossroads of Jupiter Saturn. And so we can't go back to, 2020 and like things are going on there. Like um, we have to rise up, move forward, answer the call, answer the call. Oh, right, Gray. I think we did a good job. I think we pulled it out. Fifth year running. I'm always left speechless by this point. But remind people where can people find you? What you got going on? Did you share your
Yeah,
Kepler course? I can't remember.
no. So yeah, you can find my site at graycrawford.net. If you're interested in learning zodiacal releasing, there's going to be a course through Kepler College that I'll be teaching, giving live instructions. It's a great way to learn zodiacal releasing with a teacher like myself there to kind of give you feedback, and there can be live interaction, and there's like Kepler has our own message board we can utilize for that. So that'll be a 5-week course on zodiacal releasing. You can go to the Kepler. Well, my website has a link to it, but you can go to the Kepler College website if you've been interested in learning zodiacal releasing, or even if you already know it but just want to go deeper into it. We're definitely going to get into looking at like the rulers of the periods and where they are and how that connects natally, and use the opportunity of having a course to kind of go to deeper into some of the nuances of the technique. And then in case anybody is somehow listening to this in China, I am going to teach a course in China on secondary progressions, and at the end of March. That's an 8-week course for the Nordor School, which is run by David Rayleigh. And I'm actually really excited about that, just because I did a webinar for them once, and it was really interesting to speak and then have your what you're
Translated.
saying translated. Yeah, you just kind of, it's an interesting rhythm. You have to say something and then they translate into Chinese. And yeah, that's for me just an exciting thing, because I haven't taught a course like that before. And then, but the more important thing is related to the English speaking world is NORWAC. Next year, I'll be giving 2 talks at. So if you're interested in going to NORWAC, it'll be Jupiter will have just gone into Gemini, and that whole Gemini thing we were looking at, that's going to be NORAC. So there should be it should be a great time for learning and hanging out with people in real life. And then later in September 3rd to the 15th, I'm going to be assisting Jason Hawley in leading a tour through sacred sites in Greece. That has not been really publicly announced yet, but pay attention to the beginning of the new year. If you follow me or Jason, there'll be more concrete announcements about that and what that looks like if you want to do it. And then I have my Patreon that's ongoing, which on the higher level is involving working on fixed stars. So every month we do a fixed star class, and that's been really fun. That's it.
Well, that's a lot.
Yeah. And but yeah, for me the main thing is I'll eventually have more time to produce astrology content, which would be exciting because I've always struggled to have time to do it. So
you're gonna have a lot of time.
That's exciting about actually being able to focus on it now. So I'm excited to see what happens with that.
Writing that book,
we'll see.
All right. Well, of course, I'll share Gray's information and all the offerings that he was sharing there. I'm very excited to find out more about the Greece excursion. I've always wanted to go to Greece. And so why not go with Gray? That sounds like a great time.
Why not?
Why not? Why not? So where can you find me? Well, you can find me at energeticprinciples.com. You can find me on Instagram at Energetic Principles. I don't know if Gray said, but you can find graycrawford.net, right?
Yeah.
And Gray Crawford Astrology with underscores on Instagram.
On Instagram.
Yeah. So
not Gray_Crawford. I need no other extra underscores or other letters thrown in.
There's 2 underscores.
Yeah, there's definitely fake accounts out there. You got to find
I know. We all have
Gray _ just 1 underscore in between the 3 words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the world we live in. All right. Well, if you liked what you heard here today, share it with a friend, leave a comment. If you're watching this on YouTube, tell us what you think is going to happen in 2024 or what your takeaways were here. If you're listening to this in podcast version, leave a review wherever you listen to this. Helps get the podcast shared further. Like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. I'm going back and forth. YouTube, podcast. But anyway, you can show support. That would be wonderful. I think that's really all I have to say. We have said so much. There's no more to say.
Yeah, and I think look like you've been doing some YouTube lives.
Oh, I have.
Recently, so people can
I've been doing
check that out.
Streams. Yeah, so keep in touch with some streams in the new year. I would like to do more weekly streams. It's more of a regular thing, but I figure let's get past Mercury retrograde first. And finish up some other projects that I have going on. But that is a goal of mine in the new year because I really like streaming. And it's just fun to be able to interact with people live and in real time. So stay tuned for that. All right, Gray. Well, thank you for joining me again for 5 years in a row and spending an afternoon talking through the astrology of the year ahead. It's always a pleasure to get to connect with you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, everyone. Good luck. Good luck in 2024. We're going to wish you the best. Maybe we'll do a halfway through again. See where we end up once we know more. But yeah, good luck out there. And as always, may the stars be with you.